Am I muted? Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the audience? No, virtual audience. Virtual audience. Can you hear me now? Please say, if you said that you couldn't hear me before, obviously I was talking and my mouth was moving and none of you heard me online. Can hopefully can someone say thumbs up? You can hear me now. Yes, yes, wonderful. Okay, great. I'm going to repeat a few things. Sorry about that. Those in our Ocean City audience, we have about 15 here. I apologize. Thumbs up. Awesome. I am. Forgive the technology. This is a hybrid meeting. I've done one of these beforehand in Ocean City, and it didn't have as many people online, I don't think. So I'm going to screw up along the way. My name is Chuck Boyd. Again, welcome to Ocean City, about 12 to 15 in the audience, and about 31 online right now. Great. Again, I apologize for not knowing all the technology. On the control panel, you will see two handouts for those in the virtual audience. One is an an agenda, and the second is a download of the PowerPoint presentation. For those that are here, we will make sure that you have indicated your registration that you're here. And if you haven't pre-registered, I just need a name and an email for sure. Ideally, we like to know what jurisdiction you're associated with so that we can give credit to your jurisdiction. But we will send out certificates to all the people in the audience and in the virtual audience and here. We will also provide you a link to the PowerPoint presentation. So you don't have to take copious notes during the actual presentation. Again, the folks that are online, if you want to download that, it's in your handouts. Okay, I'm going to go through a few things, and like I said, I'm going to turn off the mic, or not turn off the mic, turn off the camera, and we're going to keep the mic on from this point forward. And again, I apologize for not clicking on the right thing. You have learned one thing important in the virtual audience is how to communicate. As we go through our presentations, we're going to go continuously through. We'll have probably 1 or 2 breaks if we have to. The bathrooms, those in the real world here, it's down the hallway. Feel free to, if you gotta go, gotta go. But those in the virtual world, please submit questions. We will monitor those. We have strategic breaks on the PowerPoint that we're going to say questions, and we're going to see what questions are either in the audience virtually or here. So feel free to ask questions as you go along. If you could hold your questions, so the Q&A, I've got quite a few of them in here broken up, but we're going to try to progressively go through them so we have all the questions at one time along the way. So without further ado, I'm going to turn off the camera and I'm going to try to go through the rest of this part quickly. Okay, so okay. Again, welcome. So just to let you know, you're not alone. This planning commissioner training is in fact something that 9 other states actually require. We've been doing this for almost 10 years now. Believe it or not, Keith and Tracy have been around and doing this training every year. We do it at MML and at MACO, and then now we're doing hybrid. So we're going to probably maybe do a little less of that. So, but the planning commissioner training back in 2009 or so was when it went on board, and it's something that we found to be exceptionally useful, and it gives you a chance to relate to other planning commissioners, board of appeals members, as well as hopefully pick up some information along the way. As I mentioned already, for those in the virtual world, the questions, please feel free to ask the questions. I will look at those along the way to see what is in fact on your minds, and we'll try to answer those questions. I'll be the moderator for that portion along the way. I'm going to move the question bar slightly out of the way so the next person doesn't have to see that. So again, welcome. Planning commissioners, Board of Appeals members, small towns, big counties, Prince George's, Montgomery, all of you are supposed to get those trainings. So you're in good company. We keep a registry in our department. We send out certificates and we put the notices of the particular planning commission members on our list. And this is being sponsored by the Department of Planning and the Maryland Planning Commissioners Association in that area. So again, please be mindful that the Planning Commission training is a useful, the Planning Commissioners Association is a useful tool to share experiences, but to also learn about the issues that you're experiencing and have questions about. In addition to these virtual and in-person trainings, we do have this course online, so that someone can't come today and able to, we have it online and it's available. Again, certificates will be sent out. It's pretty painless and hopefully semi-entertaining. Thank you again. As I mentioned, Planning Commissioners is the for everyone. I want to thank you for your volunteering and your service to your communities. Without your assistance, planning commissioners, or I should say your communities, are not going to do as well by virtue of you as having that experience, that knowledge of your community. You make your communities better by sharing that with your elected officials and your fellow planning commissioners, Board of Appeals. So again, thank you for your service. As I mentioned before, my name is Chuck Boyd. I will be at the intro and at the back end of this, so you'll get tired of seeing me. But we have Keith Lackey will be the next up and presenting. He's from the regional Lower Eastern Shore Regional Office, the regional planner there. Adam Snyder, Department of Planning's counsel, will be working and presenting the law and the ethics section of it. Tracy Gordy, who's our director of the Lower Eastern Shore Regional Office, will be picking up and doing the planner commissioner's roles portion and the comprehensive plan portion, and then I will follow in and have the discussion about growth tools along the way that you use as implementing your comprehensive plans. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Keith, and he's going to make sure his mic is off, and I'm going to make sure mine is on standby. So come on up, Keith.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And I guess I need to ask if people can hear me at home or what? Okay. All right, thank you. So my name is Keith Lackey. I work with the Maryland Department of Planning. I've been with the department for about 16 or 17 years. And I work out of the Salisbury Regional Office, which covers Talbot County down the rest of the shore. And so you're in my territory right now, so behave over your period of the conference because I have my spies out on each and every one of you. So I'm going to talk about the foundations of planning. I would like to say that this course was developed in conjunction with the MPCA, Maryland Municipal League, MACO, and there was a governor's task force on future growth that developed this course. And we've been putting it on, as Chuck said, since just after the 2009 requirement that you as planning commission members and boards of appeals members take it. So one of the things that really attracted and continues to attract people to the Maryland area is how diverse this region is. We have sort of a mini America. We've got a coastal plain, a fall zone, ridge and valley provinces, and we have this proximity to DC, the whole eastern seaboard with respect to, especially from like Philadelphia down to Newport News, and so our state, and especially on the eastern shore, we feel these development pressures as a part of that attraction. We are the fifth most, how do I want to say this? I'm sorry. We're the fifth densest jurisdiction in the state, and we with aerial extent are just larger than the small New England states. And so when we have so many people with an approximate density of 630 people per square mile, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we are in a small area, and we need to have good planning to steer development towards areas where it's appropriate, and then also on the other side of that to maintain the open space and natural resources to the greatest extent possible. So what we do as planners and as citizen planners is we try to make the most efficient use of land to accommodate growth and to protect the natural environment to the greatest extent possible. And we do that through a series of ways. And one of the things that we do with respect to natural area preservation is to, we have the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation, which is a group that the Maryland Department of Planning works with. This foundation takes a look at and purchases easements on those areas that have the best soils or soils for forestry and or agriculture, and also the most vibrant agroeconomic facilities. As a part of that, priority preservation areas that are designated within the comprehensive plan also contain rural legacy areas, which is a program out of the Department of Natural Resources. And that, that group goes towards protecting large areas, tracts of land, to include agricultural and forestry areas, and to combine the state's power with nonprofit organizations that might want to be in the easement process as well. This is a map there's a whole suite of maps that you may find helpful in your planning activities. Maryland IMAP is the best source for these, and then the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Planning also have what we call dashboards of various things. And this particular one is a natural resource preservation dashboard, and you can sort this by region or by county and see current and past efforts at preserving natural resources. I'm going to speak briefly about the Maryland Historical Trust that became part of the Maryland Department of Planning in 2005. And that entity works towards identification and protection and enhancement of historic resources such as structures and lands. As a part of that, the Maryland Inventory of Historic Places is housed with MHT, Maryland Historical Trust. And also there's a National Register of Historic Places that is owned and operated by the National Park Service. And getting these designations as part of the Maryland Inventory of Historic Places and the National Register of Historic Places opens up the possibility of getting some federal and or state funds towards preservation. In addition to that, there are compliance and program requirements if you are in a designated historic district or historic place. There are requirements that when preservation is potentially adversely affected by development activity, it is reviewed by our compliance division of the Maryland Historical Trust, and they might have conditions that are proportionate to the amount of threat that may be caused by particular development activity. And that could be in the form of doing public outreach if there's an adverse impact about what that previously untouched resource might be. So what we have pictured here is, I have it written down and I've lost my place. Bear with me. The Clifton Mansion. This is a easement, one of 22 historic easements that the state has within District 25. And having this designation again is critical towards preserving those resources. Another thing that the Maryland Historic Trust tries to do is to work with local jurisdictions in development of historic preservation ordinances. So what we need to think about is whether or not we are able to accommodate growth in such a way and to develop and redevelop in strategic areas that provide for a better place to live while also providing for resource preservation. So this is the quiz, first part of the quiz. Does anybody know where this is? Yeah. There we go. Frederick, Maryland, that's correct. Yeah. Okay, very good. He passed the first of many tests throughout this presentation. Yeah. 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 Okay. So, having said that, sorry. So here are a couple of people that we would consider perhaps past champions of good planning. The gentleman to the left, his name is Edmund Bacon. He was a planning director for Philadelphia for quite some time in the early 20th century. He did a great deal of redevelopment and development activities that helped that city regain its previous stature. The gentleman that I always think has one of the saddest looking faces on America's landscape is the Daniel Burnham, the gentleman with the big mustache there. He, in planning classes, we talked about him, and one of his quotes was, "Make no little plans." And he was very much a big plan maker. He had a great deal of influence on Washington, D.C. and Chicago. And he also, this is what we called the Burnham plan. As a matter of fact, this was a plan for Chicago. And so the important thing about this particular thing is the Chicago Plan Commission was established in 1909, and it was a commission that was geared towards trying to bring this Chicago plan, the Burnham plan, to fruition. Had a lot of interactions with elected officials and the citizens as well. And the real take home from this is that there was between 1912 and 1931, there were 86 related bond bills to bring about 17 of the different projects that were done in this very large scale plan. And so that's oftentimes we talk about plans not being something that should just sit on the shelf, but should be implemented through subsequent action. And this was a great example. I'm not going to read that to you, but so here's another legend in planning field, Jane Jacobs, and she wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And this occurred as a result of the actions or the proposed actions of some elected officials in New York City that were planning to extend the Fifth Avenue right through what is called Washington Square Park, which had a very complex built environment. And the extension of that would have adversely affected existing cultural areas and the citizens of that area. And she was so outspoken about it that she was able to affect change by having that particular plan be taken off the shelf. So I'm not going to read these to you, but I will say that this is that we have guiding sustainable and efficient growth of efficient use of our land, which I spoke about, making sure that we have appropriate public infrastructure to accommodate that growth, and at the same time make sure that that growth is done in a sustainable way, and that there could be a result of economic development where appropriate. So this slide just has these 4 bullet points that don't have a great deal of explanation to them, but the overall concept behind this is you have to, when you're doing these plans, that you have to understand what the existing conditions are today, know what it is that that the citizens and the residents and the elected officials want in their particular community, and to consolidate or combine different ideas and to provide a vision for your community over the next planning horizon. The planning horizon can be, it's not a specified period of time, but generally speaking, with respect to comprehensive plans, what Tracy's going to talk about here shortly, might be anywhere from 20 to 30 years out in the future. So we've not always been equitable in our planning efforts. Matter of fact, recently in our profession, we have a new emphasis on trying to regain some of the past inequities that were a result of planning. This map here is one that resulted in the 1930s from what was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. That created areas and mapped what were called red line areas of those that were not preferable areas. And unfortunately, they oftentimes were areas of disadvantaged people or particular races. And so what resulted by that mapping was the subsequent loans being turned down or approved within certain areas that were considered desirable or not desirable. And so it had this adverse impact of having those people that could maybe most benefit from low interest loans or, for mortgages not get them just because they've been mapped as being within a red line. And so we try to work towards that now. Another tool that was done in early times, seemingly with ill intent, was what we call exclusionary zoning. We would have areas that would have such high standards for future development activity, such as requiring that every lot only be developed with a single family home. And so that discouraged multifamily homes that might be more economically affordable to those that were less able to afford a mortgage on a single piece of property with a single family home. So what we need to do now as planners is we need to look for equitable opportunities so that everyone can have opportunity for the same access to programs and development opportunities as those that are not so disenfranchised. Baltimore City and Howard County implemented what were called planning academies, and they are specifically to build community education and have leadership talk about these issues that plagued the past and how we could better approach planning in a more equitable fashion. Is there any questions at this point?
I'm going to quickly look at our audience, virtual audience, to see if you have any questions. Yes, she took on the notorious Robert Moses. Yes, Jane Jacobs, that is an excellent point. And there's even a Chicago suburb named after Burnham. So Daniel Burnham was extremely successful in motivating business leaders, community in Chicago. And as Keith has pointed out, planning is nothing without implementation. So you always want to think about, as you do your plan, is it implementable? And what do I have to do to make it happen? So you want to be thinking about that along the way. So, and which is exactly what Burnham did. And of course, Jane Jacobs in fighting Robert Moses. I don't see any other questions at this particular time, so we're going to keep on going. And again, feel free to add your questions along the way, and we'll have these stops along the way. And just one more note, which I was going to mention earlier on. We will be looking at how long in the virtual audience, I hate to say this, we're watching you, So we'll be looking at the audience. These people, I could see whether or not they're leaving or not. But the people online, I'll be looking to see if you make at least through 3 hours of the meeting. So people that leave halfway through or after Paul and before Keith or before Tracy and I, you ain't getting your certificates. So online, make sure you are staying around. So thanks a lot. And without further ado, back to Keith.
Thank you, Chuck. Oh, good? Okay, thank you. So that was the most painful part of my presentation because it's all deals with the past, and I apologize for struggling like I did, but it's like the difference between in school learning planning history in a book called the Green Book, which if any of your planners, the book's about that thick and you remember about that much that you get taught. And so that most of this stuff from this point forward is stuff that I work with on a fairly regular basis. So Maryland is the authority for local planning and zoning authority. That's an important thing to know, and one might think that it's even one of the 5 questions that I ask at the end of this presentation. That we delegated that authority to local governments, both counties and municipalities, with certain requirements. I'm going to talk about those in a few minutes. Well, first, the first requirement was before a jurisdiction could actually do any planning, they also do any zoning, they had to first adopt a comprehensive plan, which I think is a really good thing. So most of the jurisdictions in the state do exercise their local authority. Tracy and I, in our region, we have 3 municipalities that do not, but they're so small that they really didn't have the staff to even think that that would be an appropriate thing to do. And so the county that they're in works with them on that. But there are other, the land use article enables those counties and municipalities to do their planning and zoning authority. And there are other laws that the state has that has been either delegated to or required to be locally assumed that also are planning or zoning related. And those could be stormwater management regulations, sediment erosion control, forest conservation, critical area. These things are often administered at the local level. And so there are a whole suite of things that we can do. The land use article, which is a outcrop of 5 other state articles that were at one time independent articles that were consolidated principally to reflect that the requirements of Article 66B and 25A, but there were other articles as well. But that is now the go-to source for all things related to the delegation of planning and zoning authority at the local level. This is divided into 2 groups. Division 1 is for municipalities and commissioner counties and Baltimore City, and the other division is for the Maryland National Capital Park Planning Commission, and that's a long title for a particular entity. Those are in Montgomery and Prince George's County. This depicts the difference between charter and code counties and non-charter counties. Important thing to note is that the land use article affects all of those entities, charter at one in some way, charter and non-charter charter counties, and the Baltimore City. The difference between these as they are functionally, I don't know if Adam will go into greater detail, but there are a whole host of things that charter counties can do that non-charter counties can't, such as certain bond issuance, how they enact their local law, and how they assign certain taxes. So the land use article is crafted in such a way that it can specifically address each of those subtle differences as it relates to planning and zoning authority. I'm not going to read all of these. I do want to talk about just a couple important historical occurrences. One that still is a huge positive mark on the landscape is Central Park. That was established and required in 1859, and as you go into New York City, you would see the result of that. Euclid versus Amber Realty, I'm confident Adam will speak about, but that is the town of Euclid versus Amber Realty. It was important in the context that it was a Supreme Court, ultimately made it to the United States Supreme Court, and the court opined that the exercise of planning and zoning is a lawful use of the government's police power. And so from that point forward, all of the activities that local planners and zoning administrators do has to be in the context of that decision as it has been modified by subsequent court cases. And then finally, I'll just talk briefly about the National Environmental Policy Act. This required that, since 1970, it's required that all state and federal government activities or funded activities needed to prepare environmental impact statements, national environmental impact statements, and therefore address how that particular activity might affect the environment. Our department, the Maryland Department of Planning, was first, it was called the Maryland Planning Commission, but I'm sorry. Anyway, the Maryland Department of Planning was established in 1959. We have the State Land Use Act that is in 74 that enabled that delegation of powers. The Economic Resource Protection Planning Act is was the first major act that described the state's efforts and delegation of planning, and then also set forward what are called the state visions. And at first there were 7 visions, subsequently to that they upped it to 8 visions, and now 12 visions are stated in this Planning Act is what we abbreviate it for, and those have to be incorporated within the comprehensive plan, and Tracy will be talking about that in a great deal more. I'm just going to say quickly on the second to last bullet that the Smart Growth Areas Act is also what we call the priority funding area law. You will know why in about 2 slides, but this act in and of itself created this new entity of priority funding areas, but also amended the state finance procurement article. The intent of that law act when it was created was to target state monies. Back in, well, it's always been that state coffers are struggle for have less funds than maybe to administer a lot of the things that are done. But for priority funding areas, it enabled the state to further focus state spending. And I'll speak again in more detail about that in a couple minutes. And then the Sustainable Communities Act was a recent law that combined many different state funding programs under one umbrella towards creating sustainable communities. A couple of those grants that are under that umbrella are Community Legacy and Strategic Development and Infrastructure and Demolition Fund. So when the state did this, the intent was to make the most efficient use of taxpayer dollars and to maintain existing neighborhoods. And on the opposite side of that, by focusing state dollars towards areas that were intended to be developed, they also resulted in the preservation of other large natural areas. So when that law was created, all municipalities as they existed in 1997 were automatically considered priority funding areas and were eligible for state funding. The important part of that last phrase was eligible for state funding. So it doesn't mean that you will get funded because you're in a priority funding area. If funding is available and you meet all the criteria of a particular application, and you are in a municipal priority funding area that predates 1997, you could be awarded that. So what we did is the state said, we're creating this priority funding area law. We're going to allow local jurisdictions to draft, to define those areas. There are certain criteria that the state is saying has to be existing that would enable the state to concur with the local certification. And with respect to residential development, that the zoning will permit at least 3.5 dwelling units per acre, and that they're in existing or planned water and sewer service areas, and that those areas are of such a size that they are needed for the next 20 years with respect to development capacity. So we didn't want to see overbounded priority funding areas being proposed for jurisdictions that weren't even going to have that type of development pressure within the next 20 years. So to go back and talk about the intent and the result, the intent was to steer development towards designated growth areas with which the state would agree or disagree, but they would fund those areas that were designated as priority funding areas that were eligible for state funding. And this graphic here just shows that the amount of residential development that occurs within PFAs takes up much less area, land area in development activity as opposed to development activity outside of priority funding areas. So that gets back to that initial theme that I talked about, which is to steer growth into areas that are suitable and can handle that growth, and by its inverse, preserve those areas outside of that. I'm almost done, everybody. We are anticipating about 600,000 jobs by 2040. And we, as planners, struggle with the fact that we have this, over time, trying to develop more built environments, but there are a lot of incentives to be developing or even working outside of those areas. Telecommuting, for instance, is that, you know, this recent issue with the pandemic and all has demonstrated that we can have a great deal of workforce be located outside of growth areas, but they still, from time when these people who are working outside of those growth areas, they will still might have to report to their hard building or to come into the built into the municipal areas to get other services. Finally, I'm not going to read this to you, but over the past 30 years, we've developed about 650,000 acres, but it only took, from that time forward in those past 30 years, that equals the amount of development activity up to that date from colonial times. So we went from colonial times up to about 30 years ago and used 650 acres of developed area. And since that time, it's taken us 30 more years to consume the same amount of acres for development. So we are now here for the test. I had 2 people ask if they have to take a test. Is Maryland the most densely populated state, 5th most densely populated state? The answer is yes. By 2040, Maryland is expected to grow by 800,000 residents, 320,000 additional households, or 600,000 new jobs. I did not cover this directly. Yeah, all of the above is oftentimes a good answer on these things, isn't it? Why do we plan? To guide land use, to provide infrastructure, to protect natural resources, or to foster economic development, or all of the above. Okay. This should seem familiar to you. I might have hinted that this would be a question. Where do Maryland jurisdictions sit for planning authority? All right. No. All right. Yeah. I can at a cost. At a cost. Oh, I did.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Make priority funding areas. What are we doing with priority funding areas? To make the most efficient use of tax dollars, are located outside of growth areas, are drawn by the state, and only include municipalities. Hey, I apologize. That's all right.
Great, thank you, Keith. We are going to see if oh, don't run away.
I'm running away. I used my 25 minutes. I'm done.
Well, that's okay, but we need to make sure that if there are any questions for you, Keith, we want you to be the, okay. 1984, Big Brother is watching us. Okay. I'm not sure what the context of that was, but is this Euclid in Ohio? The answer is yes, in terms of the question about that. And I just want to note one of the things that Keith talked about in that one thing was, you know, why do we plan the different things? One of the things was gauge. One of the things that our department particularly is trying to do, providing resources to you at the local level, is some of the metrics, some of the things. So the numbers that Keith pointed out are some of the things that we try to provide you, not only at the state level, but also at a local level, so that you as planning commissioners or Board of Appeals members are aware of what's happening, rates of consumption, rates of development, et cetera. So that that's an important aspect of planning. Planning is not just all visionary, but it's also looking at the conditions on the ground and what has happened recently. And we try to provide some of those resources. So seeing that there are no other questions, and without further ado, we are going to move forward and head on to the law section with Adam Snyder, and he is ready to roll. And you can click that, and that should work fine.
Should work.
Should work. No guarantees, but hopefully, fingers crossed.
See if it's, yep, mic's working. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Last time I was in this room, I was delivering a 2-hour lecture on the Public Information Act. For that, we had to seal the doors for everyone's safety because people were like climbing over each other trying to get out of the room. I'm hoping you all want to be here because we're talking about what you all are doing, planning and the legal underpinnings of planning. So I'm talking about the law. And we got a lot to cover here. We're talking about the legal authority for planning and zoning, constitutional underpinnings of the Fifth Amendment, the Takings Clause, equal protection. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the broad overview of planning and zoning in Maryland. And then we're going to end up with a brief little summary of government ethics, that the ethics rules that will apply to you and other government employees. So the constitutional underpinnings, we really have to go back to 1789. We are, as you know, you hear this all the time in civics class, a collection of sovereign states that got together to create this union. And in order to make that union kind of hold together, they had to cede some authority to the federal government. So you have a federal government that has certain powers and the states that have others. And that's all spelled out in the 10th Amendment. Now, the 10th Amendment is not one of your sexier amendments, not the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or anything like that. It's an afterthought. It's number 10 on the Bill of Rights. But it really is important for planning and zoning because it's the principle that defines where does state power begin or end and when does federal power begin. And it provides that the power delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. So the presumption is that unless you can find a textual basis for a power, a federal power in the Constitution, it lies with the state. And the reserved powers, the powers reserved for the state include police powers. You heard Keith mention this a little bit, the font of zoning authority. And when you think about it, it makes sense. There's no police. There's FBI agents, there's BATF agents, National Guard who come in sometimes help, but there's no federal police force. That's a municipal, state, and a county role. So the states have the police powers. And Keith talked about Euclid versus Amber Realty. And why that's important is that police power is the basis for planning and zoning, and that came to the Supreme Court in the Euclid versus Amber Realty case. Now, some of you may be familiar with the term Euclidean zoning. That comes from this case. It's not because of the Greek mathematician who is the father of modern geometry. It's because of this little town in Ohio that we talk about Euclidean zoning. So there, the Supreme Court, you know, the way the case happened was the town zoned the land within their jurisdiction, said we're going to have industrial uses over here, residential uses over here, and the owner of some land that was placed in the residential area but wanted to develop his land for industrial uses sued and said, hey, you're telling me what I can do with my land. You can't do that. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, the state, the localities, the municipalities, they can do that when we're talking about broad planning and zoning. Now, there's a slight caveat down at the bottom of that slide. It doesn't mean that all applications of planning and zoning to specific properties is not going to raise constitutional problems. But in terms of planning and zoning, what planning commissions do, you're good to go. The Supreme Court has said that's fine. Now, when you're talking about how planning and zoning applies to particular properties and raises constitutional questions, it's when the Fifth Amendment comes into it. Again, it's closer to 1 and 2, the really sexy ones. It's a pretty important one. It's one that kind of draws the line between where does private property end and when does public interest in private property begin. And it says textually, nor shall private property be taken for public use without compensation. All of those words in blue up there probably have about 500 cases construing what they mean. Just a huge font of litigation, all of those provisions. We're not going to be talking about most of those. We're going to touch on public use a little bit, but mainly we're going to be talking about what does it mean to constitute a taking. There are, generally speaking, three forms of takings. There's eminent domain, regulatory takings, and certain types of exactions, covering all three of those. Eminent domain is probably the most familiar to you. It's when the government comes in and says, we want to put a road through your backyard. They've got to pay you for that. They've got to give you fair market value for the land that they're taking. But it's been the item, the power that's been used for public works projects for a long time. It still has to be exercised for a public purpose or a public use. And that principle got, skipped a little bit. That principle got tested also before the Supreme Court when District of Columbia was taking over blighted property in order to raise it and give the land or sell the land to developers who would build something that was generating tax dollars, was not blighted, would be something that the community could use. And it was challenged because, well, wait a minute, you're not building a road. You're going to raise this property and sell it to another private person to build. That was upheld as a valid public purpose. And you think about it, sure, you got a blighted property, so there's lots of, it's a vector for paths, for maybe crack houses, what have you. There's a lot of bad that threats to public safety and health and welfare that a blighted area can be the source of. Then, 50 years later, they ruled the same way in a case where it wasn't blighted at all. It was just that the municipality wanted to make more tax dollar intensive use of the land, wanted to develop the waterfront into a vibrant commercial and business area that would generate tax dollars and would be an amenity to the folks in the area. There was a couple people who held out and their property was condemned, and they challenged it on public use grounds that, hey, my property isn't blighted. I'm just sitting here, I'm living here, I'm doing fine. Court upheld that as well in a bitterly split decision. And if I'm a betting man and this issue comes to the Supreme Court again, I'm not sure they're gonna rule it the same way. But this time they upheld the economic development as a legitimate public use for purposes of the takings clause. So now probably most of you are not going to have to deal with direct eminent domain. I mean, again, that's state highway administration, maybe departments of public works that might come up for them. Really, you're going to be dealing with the concept of the regulatory taking. Now, the regulatory taking, that's, as its name suggests, is a taking that occurs, and it was virtually unheard of in the first 150 years of our country, because let's face it, states and localities didn't do a lot of regulation of land. They, sometimes you'd have cases come up where a municipality would raise a bunch of wooden houses that were standing in the way of a fire, and they wanted to create a fire break. And in those cases, the court would say, no, that's not a taking, even though you destroyed those people's property, because you're exercising your police powers. You're trying to protect lives and property by raising those houses. And so that's okay. You don't have to pay compensation for that. But you didn't, the kind of regulation of land that you get later on. And that starts, we saw it in Euclid. Euclid's in the 1920s. Am I not going through? Okay.
Sure.
The Euclid decision was in the 1920s, and it just shows that you're starting to get this kind of waking up and baby steps towards regulating land use a little more robust. Now, that then got the Supreme Court, not Euclid so much so, but 4 years earlier in another case involving a Pennsylvania statute that required coal companies to leave coal underground in place if it would result in the houses on top of the land subsiding. Seems like a perfectly sound exercise of the police power. We don't want to have people's houses sliding off into some hole. The court said that raises takings problems. And on the police power, this is the first time you hear the Supreme Court talking about the limits of the police power. And you see the natural tendency language there. The natural tendency of human nature would be to extend the qualification more and more until at last private property disappeared. But what the court is saying there is they're talking to people like me, government lawyers who are in courts defending state, environmental regulation. And we're forever saying, well, this is an exercise of the police power. It can't be a taking. And the court is saying, we recognize that. You can't just call something an exercise of the police power and automatically be immune for takings claims. So that's the first time the court says, you got to watch out when you're applying land use restrictions to individual properties. That could be a problem. Now, on the limits, what is the standard that the Supreme Court announces in this seminal, groundbreaking case? While private property may be regulated to a certain extent, if regulation goes too far, it will be recognized as a taking. If it goes too far, that's it. And this language gets quoted over and over again in subsequent cases as kind of a general description of takings principles. Begs the obvious question, how far is too far? Is this like, Justice Stewart, very famous, when he's talking about pornography, I know it when I mean, we kind of have that situation here where it just, well, if it goes too far. So then after this decision, there was a series of cases where they tried to figure out how far is too far. And they hit upon this multi-factored test in the Penn Central case in the late 70s. And the Supreme Court said you gotta weigh three factors: the economic effect of the government action, essentially, how does it affect your property value? How does it affect the uses of your property? The reasonable investment-backed expectations. Did you buy your property at full market value, or did you buy it deeply discounted because you knew it was subject to these restrictions and wouldn't be fully developable? The character of the government action. Does this feel like the government trying to get a park without paying for it? Or does it feel more like the government exercising its core police powers and trying to protect public health and welfare? But still, when you look at this, these are hard things to apply. You apply them in individual cases. It's a difficult test to predict. There's no bright line rule. Now, Chuck's got a Q&A slide in here already. I'm looking at.
You have such important stuff. Just want to check and see if we have any questions here. about trend of development appears to be lower than the okay. Federal, there's the FBI, that's federal law enforcement. I'm not sure what that. Some might say disappear as a private hidden is a bad idea. Are you going to address the First Amendment rights and sign issues?
I am not.
Okay, we have one audience question.
Two of them, actually.
Okay.
Urban renewal, broadly speaking, would fit under that case about the kind of the blighted areas. So if you're doing urban renewal by raising dilapidated neighborhoods, that would be for a public use. You'd still have to pay for that. I mean, that is still the exercise of eminent domain. It's just that the owners of the dilapidated properties can't sue to stop you on the grounds that it's not the exercise of a public purpose.
Okay, just back, I want to get back to the sign question. So we are not going to be touching the details of signs. The sign issue is a very complicated issue of the what content versus how you regulate signs from an area-wide perspective. It will handle it has its own separate effort. We have some webinars on this subject already that we may make available. So anyone that has a question that we can't answer, please email me or your regional planner, and we will find some resources to address those, or have Adam provide you some counseling or direct you to your or counsel to your counsel, I should say. Lawyers talk to lawyers, so we'll provide some assistance if there's a specific area that we can't have. Go ahead over there.
Yeah, is there adequate legal basis today for managing climate, or how is that beginning to be done through planning?
Wow. That's up before the Supreme Court, not in the planning context, but they're being asked to revisit climate change as a basis for some EPA regulations. So we're going to hear more about that, but I know that planning and zoning is beginning to take into consideration climate change. And in terms of how that fits within constitutional bounds, that's really the reason why you're doing the planning and zoning, is to try to avoid the ravages of climate change, or however you want to describe it. The takings analysis is going to remain the same. I think the states, localities have police powers to deal with climate change, but to the extent that it impacts individual properties in a way that affects their use of the properties, then you're going to have these constitutional issues.
Could we say that certain actions are likely to create development that in the future will have adverse effects that will cost the public down the road? So there will be flooding, there'll be other impacts that the public will be on the hook for. So is there a way to look at that now?
That's always talked about in terms of regulating coastal development, and that doesn't get you off the hook constitutionally speaking. If you plan and that planning is applied to a specific property, so you're telling someone you can't develop that because 30 years from now it's going to impose public costs that the public is going to bear, the Supreme Court would almost certainly say, well, then increase taxes. I mean, that's an impact on the public at large that should be borne by the public at large and not the individual private property owner. It's one of the ways that they look at this issue, and is one that this court, the makeup of this court, is particularly keen on doing.
Gentlemen over here.
One other question real quick. So if I have two publicly owned spaces and I have a property in those two properties, right when you stood there, would that be regulatory thinking or would that be?
So repeat the question because the people in the audience can't hear it.
Yeah, so.
No, I know. He's going to repeat
I'm going to
the question.
repeat it. So the question was, there were two publicly owned parcels of land and a private one in between, and the idea was to put a right of way through it. That would be most likely a straight eminent domain. You're essentially condemning a property interest, not the whole thing, but a right of way. There can be circumstances if that parcel in the middle is coming in for a permit, where perhaps you might be able to require the right of way as a condition of the permit, but we're going to get to that about the rules that apply there fairly shortly.
One other quick question was regarding, is there a legal definition of blighted?
No,
Okay.
there's no, yeah, you just read it. So.
Well, yeah,
I
well,
don't have to repeat it.
well, there's no, but I will say in terms of depending upon federal programs, there are certain definitions or certifications that local governments have to do if you're trying to use certain programs. The Community Development Block Grant Program, for example, requires you to designate, to take advantage of certain of their funding opportunities. You may have to designate an area as blighted. That definition is ultimately a local decision under that program. So again, not answering it from a legal perspective, but from a programmatic perspective, it tends to be a local decision based upon facts that are developed locally to support that certification, that determination.
Yeah, and that definition of blighted at the locality is ultimately a legal decision that will have legal ramifications, but there's no constitutional definition of blighted for purposes of the takings clause.
Okay, one last question here is how do easements relate to takings?
Well,
and that's the last question.
An easement is just kind of a subset of the fee simple ownership of property. You can get an easement over someone else's land. The way this fits into takings is that if the government wants to condemn an easement across your property, they would have to pay for it. Again, unless it fits into this development exactions principle that we're going to get to. So easement is just a form of property that either the government can condemn or maybe the government can restrict your rights under an easement, and that might give rise to takings claims. But it really doesn't, it's not really part of the takings analysis. It's just the property that we're talking about. So when we, before we broke for,
Go ahead, just to make sure it advances. So
I'm going to,
no, I just want to make sure that that clicker works.
oh, it doesn't.
Okay. Try again.
Now
Okay.
it does. Okay. Well, when we were last talking, we were talking about the Penn Central test and had those three factors, and I was making the point that it's not a bright line test. Very hard to predict how it's going to apply in a particular case. That starts to change a little bit in the 1980s. The Supreme Court starts to create what are called categorical tests, where if you fall into this category of government action, it is automatically a taking. You don't have to look at all these other factors. You don't have to weigh anything. You're done. You win. So the first is this versus Teleprompter Manhattan case, where the government action was to require apartment buildings in New York City to affix to the building a 5 square foot cable box and all of the wiring associated with it, whether or not anyone in the building received cable. It was about creating kind of a highway of cable throughout New York City so that everyone would be able to get cable if they wanted it. And an apartment owner sued, saying, hey, you're telling me what to do with my property. You can't do this. And the Supreme Court found that there was a taking. And what they concluded was when the character of the government action is a permanent physical occupation of property, that's a taking. It doesn't matter that it's really small. It doesn't matter that it's for a good kind of purpose of making cable available to others. It's just, it is a taking. So if the government is occupying your property or allowing someone else to occupy your property, it's a taking. That's called a physical taking. Then about 10 years later, the bigger case was decided. This is the Lucas versus South Carolina Coastal Commission case. Mr. Lucas owned 2 undeveloped lots alongside some beachfront lots, alongside some lots that had previously been developed. And the Coastal Commission enacted a law that said, waterward of a certain line in the sand, literally a line in the sand, you cannot build. And the purpose of it was to protect sand dunes that were behind it, protect the other existing buildings that were further shoreward from, damage from hurricanes and storm surge and what have you. But for Mr. Lucas, he had these 2 beachfront properties next to lots that had already been developed and was being told that he could not build them. He sued, and the Supreme Court held that a taking occurs when regulation denies a landowner of all economically viable use. That is the key test in terms of how the takings clause works out with respect to individual property. Every takings plaintiff tries to get into that box. And so this is the one that you have to be most. Now, Lucas style per se takings only occur when the regulation denies effectively all economically viable use. And a diminution of value is not enough. So if a regulation means that you're, $100,000 instead of $200,000, that's not going to be a taking. But if it reduces the value from like 200,000 to 1,000, well, now you're talking. But it's difficult to get into that box because that's a pretty big time restriction on property. Normally government regulation doesn't have that stark an impact. And then you're back in this Penn Central weighing test, which historically and kind of empirically has been pretty friendly to the government. It's difficult as a takings plaintiff to win unless you get into one of these per se boxes. Now, one effort to do that is to come up with the notion of the partial taking. So let's say I own a piece of property that's 100 acres and one corner of it, 20 acres, let's say, it consists of wetlands. So I submit a permit application to the government. I just want to develop this 20-acre corner of my property. And the government looks at it and says, well, we're not going to let you develop 20 acres of wetlands. We're going to deny that. They say, well, you've denied all economically viable use because I can't do anything with that 20 acres. It's just, I have to leave it alone. That doesn't work. The Supreme Court looks at what is called the parcel as a whole. So they'll look at the whole 100 acres and apply these tests. And under the Penn Central test, that's a 20% diminution of value. You're not going to come close to a takings in that context. Now, I am going to move on to exactions, and maybe we can answer your question. An exaction is an affirmative condition placed on a permit or some other government authorization. And under certain conditions, it can amount to a taking. So the best way to explain this, I think, is to talk about the 2 seminal cases in this area that generated the rational nexus requirement and the rough proportionality requirement. The first is Nolan versus California Coastal Commission. The Nolans, you can see from this diagram here, they had a house and a private beach behind their house. They wanted to build a much, much bigger house. The Coastal Commission said the construction of that large house is going to impair the public's ability to see that there's a beach down there. And that's the problem. So as a condition of the permit, we'll let you do that. But as a condition of it, you have to allow the public to move back and forth across your private beach. So it's effectively give the public an easement. The Supreme Court said, you can't do that because allowing people to walk back and forth on their private beach has nothing to do with how the house blocks people's view of the water or the beach. The two just aren't really related. There has to be a rational nexus between the condition you're imposing and the impact presented by the project. The next part of the test came a few years later in Nolan versus City of Stuttgart. There must be rough proportionality in nature and degree between the impacts of a proposed development and the exactions that are required as a condition of approval. And in that case, the folks were expanding their business, and it was going to create additional traffic and was going to have some stormwater impacts. The government said, okay, we'll let you do that, but you have to pay for bike lanes here and elsewhere, and you have to pay for a public greenway elsewhere that would help reduce stormwater impacts in the municipality at large. The court said that that was no good, that bike lanes don't really do anything to lessen traffic, car traffic that would be going to this business. And in terms of the stormwater impacts, you are already requiring on parcel stormwater mitigation. So this other stuff you're doing over here about the greenway that's going to reduce stormwater impacts later on, that's way too much. You can't do that. It's not roughly proportional to the impact caused by the development. Now, we're talking again about how these principles apply to specific properties. That's where these constitutional principles, you get into trouble as a government regulator. When you're talking about broad things like, tax measures and impact fee measures that apply to everyone, it's far less likely to constitute a taking. It's really when it's imposed on a specific property as a result of their efforts to develop that property where you get into constitutional issues. All right, I'm going to move on now to the 14th Amendment. We're going way up. We're up in, we're up in the mid-teens, but this is a pretty important one. It's the amendment that applies things like Brown v. versus Board of Education, the groundbreaking desegregation case in the 19th. And it says, nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay, fine. What does that mean? That doesn't really give you that much clue. Equal protection is all about classifications. It's about treating people, property, businesses differently depending on their characteristics. And it's okay to do that. The courts are very deferential if you are making those distinctions for rational reasons. We zone for industrial uses differently than for residential uses because they present different impacts on the community. It's okay to treat them differently. But when you classify on the basis of things like race, ethnicity, other suspect classes, or on fundamental rights, like, you voted one way last election, and so we're gonna, you're not gonna be allowed to develop your permit or something, or develop your property. That's when you're almost guaranteed to lose. So whenever the government characterizes people, again, race is the big one, where you characterize, classify people based on race, classify property based on maybe the race of the owner or the First Amendment activity of the owner. That's subject to something called strict scrutiny, and you pretty much are guaranteed to lose. It's really, really difficult to win. Again, but when we're talking about zoning, it really is inherently discriminating. You are making these distinctions between residential, industrial, commercial areas. But that's okay because it is rationally related to a public purpose. It's not based on race or other suspect classes. So it is subject to a very deferential review. You just have to have a rational basis for it, and you should be okay. We have another one of these Q&A sessions. Chuck, unbelievably, is far more technically savvy than I am. So he's going to help with this.
It doesn't look like we have any more questions from the virtual audience. Do we have any questions here about the regulatory takings and what we just went through? If not, we do have a question over there.
Putting in some interchange development, so all of a sudden, property like escalating through the roof. And now it's a benefit. And we tax that or somehow get a benefit.
Well, if you have property, there's property taxes, presumably you're going to recoup some of that through the increase in their property taxes. But no, there's no, constitutional giving principle where the government does something, it improves property values that you can recoup that through anything other than, tax rates.
There are mechanisms. Again, he's going to tell you the law. I'm going to tell you
How they really do it.
a programmatic way. They're what is called improvement districts. So tax increment financing. So you can invest public dollars in, or for example, define an area, invest and float bonds and borrow money to invest in that area. And then through the increment of the taxes that is raised beyond what it was before, pay off the bonds. So there are ways to try to recoup the economic benefit of a public investment. There are benefit districts is another way where the community as a whole kind of taxes themselves to actually put services in a particular area targeted that, again, typically are not part of the taxes of it. But that's the benefits of it. And that's what people are invested in local government and deciding where planning of roads are, et cetera. It does anything in planning, you affect property values, rightly or wrongly, positively or negatively. You need to be mindful of that. And then you obviously need to be mindful of the legal issues about it. But that's an inherent component of planning. You have the influencing of market values in your community. I think you're ready to go, I hope.
Yeah. All right. Now we're going to talk about planning and zoning in Maryland. We're going to move off of the constitutional underpinnings and talk a little bit about planning and zoning in Maryland. Keith gave you a little bit of an overview of that. Some of what I'm going to talk about echoes what he says, starting with labyrinth state laws that apply to planning and zoning. Planning, and I'm going to talk separately about planning and zoning for counties and for municipalities. The state has delegated planning and zoning authority. I think Keith talked about this to counties. Counties and code counties, their authority for all of this lies in the government article, and that used to be, Keith mentioned these former articles that have been recodified. So you'll see 25A, 25B, 2566B. They've all been reincorporated into these broad land use and local government articles within the Maryland Code. And then, as Keith pointed out, Prince George's and Erie County have different because they're affected by the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which has a lot of authority in this area. So you saw this slide before. It breaks up the different counties based on whether they're charter or code county or non-charter county. Now, between these is that charter counties are counties that have essentially adopted their own constitution. That is their county charter. And they were authorized to do this early in the 20th century. And that when they do that, they have a lot more inherent power to take on actions within their jurisdiction. And the General Assembly has a correspondingly less amount that they can do in terms of regulating within that county. So it's this kind of push and pull between the state legislature and the local legislature. And if a county becomes a charter county, they get powers and the General Assembly loses powers. There's also something called the code counties. Now, the code counties are counties that, becoming a charter county is kind of arduous. You've got to adopt a constitution. It goes through an elaborate process. In the 1960s, the legislature altered the Maryland Constitution to create kind of a workaround that would allow counties that didn't think it was worth it to go through the charter process can nevertheless get significant home rule powers while remaining a code county with a board of commissioners instead of a county executive or something like that. So charter counties and code counties have a fair amount of local autonomy. The blue counties are the non-charter counties, or the commissioner counties, you often hear them referred to as. They are governed by a board of commissioners. They have fewer powers than charter and code home rule jurisdictions, and the General Assembly has correspondingly greater powers. Commissioner form of governance is the oldest. It's been around since the beginning of Maryland. And again, early 20th century charter counties came into being. Then in the 60s, you got code home rule. Here's a list of the different ones. If you're not such a visual learner, you can just see where your county is and what category it falls into. Now, moving on to municipalities. The state has also delegated planning and zoning authority to municipalities. You find authority for that in the local government article and in the land use article in Division 1. Municipal planning and zoning authority applies only within municipal boundaries, but including areas that are annexed. There's some rules that apply there when you're annexing areas that was zoned by the county and is now going to be zoned by the municipality. And the municipal authority cannot be exercised. It conflicts with either the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission authority or the Washington Suburban Sanitation Commissions. All Maryland municipalities are incorporated. If you're not incorporated, if you're just an unincorporated town, you don't have planning and zoning authority. You're subject to county authority. So there are 157 Maryland municipalities sprinkled throughout the state. There's none in Howard and Baltimore County. But other than that, they're sprinkled all over. And again, they have delegated planning and zoning authority. State delegation comes subject to certain requirements. You have to adopt a local comprehensive plan. There has to be consistency between the zoning and land use regulations, the stuff that takes the plan and translates it into regulations that would affect individual properties. There has to be consistency between the two. And the plan has to implement the state's 12 planning visions, things like planning for growth areas, for adequate infrastructure, for environmental characteristics. Now, how you go from that, from kind of broad planning and zoning to bring it applicable to individual properties, you have to enact ordinances. Those ordinances have to have their purpose to promote health, safety, and general welfare. Again, this is all flowing from the police power. Typically, these ordinances will regulate density, height, and bulk. It was density and intensity because I guess it's an interesting mnemonic. Now, when we're talking about zones, there's in a particular zone, there's uses that are permissible by right, and then there are uses that are permissible with a special exception. And essentially, the difference is that the area that's zoned residential, you have a right, by right, to build a residence in there because you're zoned for that purpose. Special exception is when you zone an area as residential, but say, well, you can build a grocery store here if you meet certain requirements. That would be a way that you could build something, build a grocery store in a residential area through a special exception. And we'll talk about that a little more briefly. So comprehensive zoning, that encompasses both original zoning and comprehensive rezoning, is the very broad brush zoning. It's taking these planning visions and translating them to a map that has broad areas that are classified for set aside different types of uses. It's a legislative act. It's regulating across the jurisdiction. It's not regulating with respect to a specific property. And as a result, it gets a lot of deference from the courts because, again, you're not taking that regulatory power and imposing it on a specific property just yet. That comes later on. Comprehensive zoning, again, it has to implement the comprehensive plan or plan update. Some requirements it has to cover. Again, I said the whole or substantially the whole area. It has to be the product of careful study. It can't, you know, again, you're trying to prove the rationality of this. So if you're doing it by throwing darts at the wall or what have you, that's not going to fly. You're going to have to be able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing, back it up. But it will, in some extent, control and direct the use of land within that area. Now, that's a fairly draconian thing when you think about it. You've got this big map, you've put 3 or 4, however many zones on it, and it's a pretty cookie cutter thing. It's all, everyone's going to be treated the same in those, and we know that there are going to be individual properties in those different zones where it might not make sense for them to be a resident. So there are ways to adjust what's the seeming inflexibility of a zoning to account for these property-specific differences or unique characteristics to allow for, you know, not people's property rights being frustrated all over the place. So I'm going to go over a few zoning do's and don'ts. These are all fall into the basket of zoning decisions that are specific to individual properties, some of which are permissible, some are not. Spot zoning is generally not permitted. Now, spot zoning is when you're actually doing your zoning. You're doing your comprehensive zone and you've got this whole area that this is all residential, but this one lot here in the middle, we're going to make it commercial. Now, if you have a reason for that, and it's not inconsistent with the uses in the district, again, maybe we're talking about a grocery store, and it's not being done for the owner's private interests, that's okay. You have to be able to establish that. Spot zoning, you'll hear it, it's a negative, it's a bad word, but you can have spot zoning if you've thought it through and can show it's consistent with the rest of the zone. You know, and again, the rule is really just looking out for sweetheart deals, that you're zoning this area, and we're going to allow this one person to make out like a bandit when we're telling everyone else they can only use their stuff for residential use. Contract zoning is not permitted. That's where you've got your zoning already, and you go, the zoning authority makes a side agreement with a particular property owner to zone their property in some other way. It's prohibited because zoning is supposed to be, you know, uniform. It's supposed to be all done at the same time. It's not supposed to be, you do that and then you go and have a bunch of kind of behind closed doors agreements to adjust those, particularly for people, you know, when it's really being done for the private interest of the owner. And it's prohibited, again, because it allows for this kind of special privilege that we want to avoid, disrupts the comprehensive nature of land use plan, and this whole municipal power of zoning is being exercised in a very non-public, non-uniform way. Piecemeal. Now, Piecemeal zoning is a parcel-specific change in a zoning classification. Again, it happens after the original comprehensive zoning. So you've got this area that's all residential, and someone comes in and says, I want to change that. Now, you can do that, but only under two circumstances. When government can show that they made a mistake in the original zone, or that there's evidence of substantial change in the character of a neighborhood since the government did the original zoning. So a mistake from the get-go where, you know, maybe, and I'm making this up, maybe you do your zoning plan based on the assumption that there's going to be a highway over here, and so your zoning area is around it, and then lo and behold, the Federal Highway Administration puts it someplace else, and it messes up the whole zoning. That might be an example of a mistake, or a substantial change, perhaps, if it's based on the assumption of where that highway is and now it's moved someplace else. But you can't just go back and change it through piecemeal zoning because you want to help out a particular landowner who is you know, being restricted by the land use, the zoning rule. Special exceptions. These are also called conditional uses. You'll hear them used interchangeably. This is not a change in zoning like piecemeal zoning is. It's granting an additional compatible use. You might remember a few minutes ago, I talked about you have a zoning ordinance that is enacted that says this area will be residential, but we can have a grocery store if you meet certain conditions, certain restrictions, certain characteristics. Then that allows, that's built into, it's baked into the zoning ordinance itself. So it's not, when the person comes in and says, I want a special exception to build a grocery store here, and they satisfy the conditions, they're not asking for a change in zoning because that's already baked in the zoning process. They're just, you know, implementing or triggering that, that special exceptions process. Now, there are some requirements, though. Again, it has to be identified in the zoning, has to be compatible with the neighborhood. Grocery store would be a good example of that. Here's a dentist office is in this example here, that the house looks just like the residence, not going to be huge vehicular traffic. So, and it shall further and not be contrary to the local comprehensive plan. So you'll be looking at whether the use, whether it's a grocery store or a dentist office, is furthering the residential use of that zone or not. One additional restriction. It can't have an adverse effect on adjoining and surrounding properties that is uniquely different from the effect if located elsewhere in the zone. So if it provides for a grocery store, but for some reason putting a grocery store here is going to have a greater impact on the surrounding land than if it would be over there elsewhere in the zone, well, then you can't do it. Now, a grocery store, maybe that's not going to be the case. Maybe that's a bad example, but that's part of the test. It has to have the same impact on the surrounding properties that it would have elsewhere. And the reason why that is because the legislature, by providing for the special exception, has already made the determination that they're comfortable with the impacts that that type of use will have in this particular zone. If it has different impacts when applied to this, you know, in this particular area, because something about the adjoining properties, well, then you're kind of out of the legislative box. You're straying from the decisions that the legislature has already made, and that's no good. So that's a restriction on the special exception authority. Another, when we're talking about the legislature defining the special exception, and this whole idea about, you know, adverse effect that's unique or different, the legislature defines that as well. So if the legislature says, and when considering the impact of a funeral home. Let's say they've said the funeral home is available in this area through a special exception. Here are the factors you have to look at. You have to consider whether they have, you know, the impact of noise, dust, and fumes, and lighting and whatnot. that you're bound by that. So when the special exception is ruled upon, you have to consider the things that the legislature, the local legislative body, said that you have to consider. This Clarksville residence case involved a funeral home where the surrounding community said that they had a cultural aversion to funeral homes. And it was sincere, they were able to back it up, but the court ruled against them because the legislative body, when creating the special exception, identified the criteria to be evaluated to see whether it fits within the four corners of the special exception, and cultural aversion was not one of them. So it's just not relevant to that, and the court upheld the issuance of the special exception. Now, so far, we've been talking about changes to zoning or embedded ways of tailoring zoning to a particular property. Now we're going to talk a little bit about variances, because variances are a departure from the zoning rules. It's not baked into the zoning ordinance. It's not an exercise of zoning authority. It's modifications to the requirements in the zoning law concerning density, bulk, size, and what have you, granted to avoid hardship due to conditions peculiar to the property that would result from enforcement of the restriction. The applicant can't be the one creating the hardship. Self-created hardships don't carry the day for variances, and the variance must not confer a special privilege denied to others. Now, that language that I'm reading from you is from the land use article. It doesn't, strictly speaking, apply to charter counties, but charter county standards can differ because, again, they have their own constitution, and then they enact laws consistent with that constitution. But they're, generally speaking, fairly similar with respect to the circumstances under which variances are appropriate. And the key thing about variances is the last thing. It's one way to avoid unconstitutional takings. If we've got this broad planning and zoning, it gets applied to an individual parcel, and lo and behold, the landowner can't do anything with it, you're looking at buying that property. The variance allows the flexibility to avoid that unconstitutional outcome if it meets the criteria set forth here. Here's an example here. So the property in the middle with the barn is existing. And the property to the right in the much smaller box is a new property that they want to build. Now they have the black vertical line is the existing setback requirement. They would normally have to build that new house to the left of that black line. But when they do that, they're violating a different provision that says there has to be a minimum structure and another structure. So there's no place for them to put the house there when these zoning are read together. So you get a variance from the side yard setback that allows the house to be moved over a little bit to the right so that the owner can make economically viable use of their property and still be fairly consistent with the overall rules. It's just a slight adjustment to try to avoid the constitutional train wreck that would otherwise occur. Switching gears just a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about vesting. The principle of vesting is that once the property owner has vested in their particular project, they want to develop their land. Once their rights have developed, once their rights have vested, they're essentially immune from later changes in the law that would prevent them from exercising those vested rights. So you want to develop land, you apply for a permit, you get a permit, you start to build that permit or build the project. If the law changes and said, well, you can't build that bowling alley in that area anymore, that doesn't apply to you. And it would be a taking if they say, well, you don't get to build your your bowling alley after all, because at that point you're vested. And, you know, in Maryland law, there's federal takings law and there's state takings law, and they're fairly consistent. Maryland courts follow federal Supreme Court precedents fairly closely. Not so when we're talking about vested rights. When there's vested rights, Maryland gives greater protection than the Supreme Court does. So getting to be vested is really important for both property owners and people who are opposing development. So again, you have to, in order to establish vesting, the property owner has to show that they've followed existing applicable law and has gotten the building permit and has made changes on the property manifesting commencements of work. So cleared the property, you've installed footers for the building or something like that, because that puts the public on notice that you're moving forward with a project. You've gotten your building permit and you're moving forward with it. And if they go and try to change the law on you, well, you've gotten your foot in the door, you can go ahead with it. Now, Maryland is considered a late vesting state because it requires that second bit about making changes on the property that manifest commencements of work. Other jurisdictions, other states are early vesting. They might just require a building permit. That's all you need. Some even say that rights vest when you've got preliminary approval on a plat or something like that. Those early vesting states give property owners a lot more security, a lot more protection against subsequent changes in the law. Maryland is a little more accommodating to local land use powers that are, wanting to adjust land use moving forward. Back to questions and answers. Where are you going? He's going the other way. Oh, do we have any here first?
First question is related to spot zoning. Does the spot zone have to be in the middle of the zone, or would an edge property be considered spot zoning?
I don't think it has to be in the middle.
So the question is, does the spot zone have to be in the middle of the zoning district, or can it be at an edge of it?
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be in the middle, but if it's only one and it's on the edge, you're going to have to explain why that's consistent with the overall zoning strategy. And it might be easier to do that when we're talking about an edge property, because maybe across the street is a commercial area. And so it makes more sense than having it in the middle. But again, the principle here is about singling out specific properties. If you can satisfy that you've got a rational reason for it, and it's not just to benefit the owner of that property, yeah, it could work.
Context is everything.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's one. Two, we're going through the comprehensive master plan, update process. And there always seems to be a little discussion of the authority of the council versus the authority of the Planning and Zoning Commission in this area. And this area is that one of the main questions is, can the council go in and say, not Euclidean, but we decide, like if we have 4 or 5 houses in one row of an area, it makes sense to have it all zoned one designation. But the Planning and Zoning Commission just wants to say we zone one of the 10 houses. We're being told that, by the Planning and Zoning, the council doesn't have the authority to just go in and say, if it makes sense to rezone that whole area of one district, we have that authority.
Well, do you need to repeat that?
Well, so I'm going to try to go ahead.
Yeah. The question essentially is, if the Planning Commission wants to zone an area one way and the council, the legislative body, wants to do it a different way, can the legislature do that?
For the most part.
Yeah.
Within the state of common.
Right, right. Well, the answer is it depends. There was an opinion, yes, there was an opinion of the Attorney General that concluded that the local legislative body couldn't do that. That the way the statute was structured was the Planning Commission would do the plan, submit it to the council, council would look at it. If they disagreed with it, they'd send it back. And then the Planning Commission would have another shot at it. And if the council disagreed with it, they'd send it back. And because that's what the statute said. And I'm a little familiar with that because at the time I was the guy who wrote that one. If you disagreed with it, you can come after me.
But they changed the law.
But then they changed the law
They changed the law and
almost immediately.
so they changed the law. Just so there's two things. But you're talking about a comprehensive plan, and hopefully, and the short answer to your first question, and I'm the lawyer, is the local government legislative body has final say. So in terms of the change of the law that said in terms of comprehensive plans, before it wasn't that they could unilaterally at the legislative body change it.
Right.
They changed the law. The AG decision said you got to go back and forth and work it out amongst yourselves. The infinite wisdom of the General Assembly said, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. We're going to change the law to allow the legislative body to change what the comp plan is after a public hearing, and they'll take consideration for the Planning Commission and do it. And then they may change the comp plan. But your question was more towards the question of the zoning, the comprehensive rezoning, I thought. So, which is different, because both are legislatively acted upon. The law, again, as I understand it, doesn't address that issue of because in the implementation of a comprehensive plan through the zoning, planning commissions are advisory to the legislative body. So in your case, if you describe it, say, well, we think of the comprehensive rezoning, only 2 of those properties should be done, and it gets up to the legislative body, and the legislative body says, well, thank you, Planning Commission, but we think all 5 should be. They're the ones that get elected. They're the ones that so I think in that instance of the rezoning of it, I'm not sure that whether or not there's court case on that. I think then the legislative body has a decision at the time of the rezoning. Now, they should be documenting it, and they should put a rationale, because someone will question them and say, why is this is inconsistent with your comprehensive plan if you're doing it differently? So they got to go through and justify their reasoning for expanding something that the Planning Commission. But again, I've seen them do it. Whether or not it's legal issues, I've seen them do it, and I've not seen them challenge per se. But again,
Well,
I think.
I mean, this AG opinion wasn't that long ago. It was like 5 years ago. The law was changed like 3 or 4 years ago. So we don't have a lot of case law on this issue.
Yeah, and what we were talking on the way down here, there's not a case law on the issue of consistency between a zoning and the comprehensive plan itself. So that's what they're supposed to be consistent with, and furthering that comprehensive plan through the zoning. And there's not a lot of case law on that either. So what question we have here is a property owner wants to create a campground on a property. Campgrounds are not addressed in the current zoning. Any suggestions on how to handle that?
So property owner wants to create a campground on a property. Campgrounds are not addressed in the current zoning code. Any suggestions on how to handle
So my suggestion would be, again, not the
it?
lawyer.
My suggestion would be to talk to him.
My suggestion would be amend your code. First of all, go through the planning commission process and say, hey, we have a desired use. Property owner can go to the planning commission and say that, and the planning commission should develop and say, well, campground, it shouldn't go in this residential area, but it may go in this area, and we're recommending this. And then they take it to the legislative body, and they would amend the zoning regulations to allow for that use. They may choose not to. One of the questions this raises is an issue that I see as a zoning administrator, is the question of, am I allowed to have a use if it's not specifically identified in the zoning ordinance? And again, lawyer will say, it depends. Because I've seen situations where they say, no, that use is not anticipated and we don't have it. And if you want that use, go change your zoning ordinance. I've seen other places where they liken it to a similar use. So the question is, I have a use of a office building. And then someone says, well, I really have the need for a telemarketing office. Well, is a telemarket office different than an office? That's an interpretation of the zoning administrator and how it's applying that. So sometimes the uses someone has is very specific, and the zoning ordinance tends to not have, it tends to be more generic. So in the case of a campground, I think you have to amend your zoning ordinance to accommodate the use if it's not articulated anywhere as an identified use in your zoning ordinance. And oh boy, okay, here, hold on, another one here.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I didn't jump
Yeah,
there.
you missed that one. Kind of special.
Can a special exception continue from different property owners until a future change of use?
I would think so, sure.
So again,
If it qualifies under the.
I've worked 25 years as a zoning administrator, so I'll just give you the practical experience first of this. So again, as a practitioner, it depends. What is important is you articulate your intent in your zoning ordinance. So if you have a special exception and you intend that that special exception transcend from one owner to the next owner. So I've got a beauty salon. I have a beauty salon in my residential property. I got a special exception. And that special exception meant that I can only have one chair and I can have one parking space, and that's it. I sell my house and my beauty salon to my new person that wants to buy it. They decide, I'm going to put in 3 people in here. I'm going to do all this other stuff. They assume that beauty salon. That's not necessarily true. So the critical thing is your zoning ordinance articulate whether or not a special exception can transfer from one property owner to another, and how do you handle that? Usually they handle it through zoning certificates and things like that. At minimum, you have to get a zoning certificate if you change the ownership from one to another. These are administrative functions that avoid the takings issues or the, hey, I thought I had this use and you're now saying you can't have a use. Again, the more you can spell it out in your regulations, what your intent is, the less like you're going to need the lawyer to come in and say you're Bacon later on. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I do not.
Okay. If a property owner is asking for a variance based upon another property that has been grandfathered in for a non-conforming setback because the age of the comparison property, is that valid argument for a smaller setback for a new application, for a new applicant that has come to the Board of Appeals? My question basically is about the grandfathering of in a variance as a comparison to new or upgrading of an existing property.
My initial reaction to that is that when you have a question is that long, they actually have that issue right now. And I got to be careful because I can't advise you on what the law is. I don't represent you. I represent him.
I guess
this would happen in the PIA all the time. People would have general questions.
Let me ask you a generic question. Is a variance transferable from one property owner to another as a general rule in your mind?
Transferable in what way?
If I sell my property, if I get a variance is my house now conforming? And I sell my house and I say it's conforming.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Right.
The answer is yes. That's what I was trying to get to in that. I can't answer this, and the person that wrote that question, which I'll know who it is, send me an email and we'll try to get into more details about that question later on. Oh boy.
Mary Schmidt.
Okay. Was that the last of our questions? We want to keep on moving. Go ahead.
So my question is related to the barn variance in the house placement, put it to the one side of the property.
Right.
Why are they not doing a variance on the barn? Because they're basically
Go ahead back. I think
that
we're good
person's
now.
property, 3/4 of their property. They're taking why aren't they adjusting the variance?
Well, because the barn's been there forever.
That barn should be removed next year.
Well, and if it is removed, and if it's removed before that other house comes along, then that you don't have this issue. And if you know that that barn is going to be removed and you're the owner of the other property, maybe you wait.
It has to be 100 feet, I'm in 75, and I sign a waiver to say I don't care about the minimum. Like, who sets that distance?
You do.
Well,
The government does.
In this particular case, this is Paul example. The separation of the barn from any future structure is on the barn property. Now that you want to build up, you want to build a new house on that adjacent lot, you could theoretically adjust that barn separation, or you could adjust the side yard, either of which was determined by the Board of Appeals in terms of that, because you're right. That arc is really, it's an arc that's going on that particular property, but it's relative to the barn. So I have a barn separation and I have a side yard separation, both of which are affecting that property, that new property. The Board of Appeals could have adjusted either one of those two to ensure that there was a buildable area.
I don't want to make a non-conforming use.
Well, and by that other statement, the answer is you're not. By you're getting a variance and you're making it conforming at that particular point because you have received the appropriate variances for that lot.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to move forward. I think we're good to go, and you're hopefully back online.
Okay, can you minimize that?
So move it down.
All right. So let's move on, talk a little bit about boards of appeal. The authority for boards of appeals for non-charter and municipalities come from the land use article. In charter and code counties, it's found in the local government article. While they're required for non-charter commissioner counties and for municipalities, they're authorized code counties. But all of them have it, whether it's mandatory or not. They all have, all jurisdictions have a board of appeal. Oh, my thing is not working. There. Well, I can do it manually. So some rules about membership on the Board of Appeals. At least 3 members. They have served 3-year terms. They're appointed by the local executive, confirmed by the local legislative body. The memberships these rules do vary with whether an entity, whether a county is a charter county or a non-charter county. So for charter counties and code counties, which again have more greater local powers, it's as established by the local law. But for commissioner counties, those are the rules. And this is, again, kind of an example of the difference between those types of, different types of counties. Roles and responsibilities of the Board of Appeals. When we're talking about non-charter, when we're talking about commissioner counties and municipalities, you hear and decide on appeals where an error is alleged in the administrative enforcement or application of local land use law, special exceptions to to zoning ordinances, and applications for variances. In charter and code counties, it's a fair bit broader. Again, it's established by local law, but it's generally broader than you see for the commissioner counties. And they can look at things like applications for zoning variations, exceptions, or zoning map amendments, administrative actions, reviewing administrative actions on licenses, permits, approvals, waivers, etc., and even the assessment of special benefit tax. And that's because, again, greater authority, local powers in a charter code home rule county. Rules of procedure. They are boards of appeals have a variety of formal requirements that attach to their proceedings. So they must be publicly announced. They're subject to the Open Meetings Act. A little shout out here to the MML, MACO, both work with Legit and University of Maryland to put on the Academy for Excellence program that has classes on Open Meetings Act that every public body that is subject to the Open Meetings Act has to designate one member to take this training. And it's a really in-depth training. I recommend it to you if you're lucky enough to be the designated member of your planning commission that has to take the test, take the training. But it's a worthwhile endeavor. Proceedings must be recorded. Witness testimony must be under oath, must comply with local rules, procedures on the order of proceedings and whatnot. These are kind of almost trial type proceedings. It's not like you're in court, but you're getting there. It feels a little bit like that. When it comes to making a decision, you have to deliberate, vote in open session. In most cases, the record must reflect the vote of each member on any matter voted upon, and the written opinion must reflect factual findings and legal conclusions. One of the reasons why you want to have your factual findings and your legal conclusions spelled out in your Board of Appeals decision is because they are subject to review by the courts. And when courts review what lower agencies, they give deference to factual findings. The Board of Appeals is seeing people testify. They can evaluate their credibility, decide who to believe when there's conflicting testimony. A reviewing court can't do that. All they can get is a transcript. They don't see the person sweating. You don't see the person fidgeting. So factual findings are given deference on appeal, but the reviewing court is not bound by the local jurisdictions or the Board of Appeals conclusions of law. There can be some instances where you can get a little bit of deference in how you interpret your own law, but generally speaking, factual findings get a lot of deference on judicial review. Conclusions of law do not. They have to be heard on the record. So lawyers just get up and they argue about it. You don't get a new round of new witnesses coming in and testifying before the circuit court or an appellate court. That all happens at the Board of Appeals stage. Now, a word about service on Board of Appeals. If you are on the Board of Appeals, you have to be wary of ex parte communications. If you're at picking up some donuts and someone who has a map for you stands next to you and starts talking about the case, well, you're going to have to disclose that to all parties and summarize the conversation on the record. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to recuse yourself, but you just have to disclose it all so that everyone involved knows that this conversation occurred. Best to avoid donut shops when you've got matters before you. This was my opportunity before Chuck inserted like others into my, should I keep moving? I'm gonna keep moving. We'll circle back and get the questions because we're now gonna move on to ethics. And that's a nice segue from ex parte communication to ethics.
I know, I just want, so we'll get this question afterward.
That's the same one, that's the one we already have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Just double checking. Go ahead. I think you're.
There we go. All right. Ethics law prohibit both improprieties and appearances of impropriety. The purpose is to ensure fair dealings by officials holding positions of public trust. Obvious enough. Flows from General Provisions Article 807, counties and municipalities must impose on conflicts of interest, financial and lobbying. those provisions must be similar to state ethics rules. Now, similar to mean identical, they can vary in ways, or if needed to be adjusted to fit the circumstances of a local jurisdiction, that's okay, but have to be similar to state ethics rules. Examples of conflicts of interest: you can't hold outside employment that would impair impartiality or independence of judgment. I'm trying to minimize your questions thing because it's blocking. Okay, so a forester in DNR's Forest Service could not serve as a member of a local planning commission because the commission had duties relating to site plan approval and forestry management activities that were regulated by DNR. So you'd be doing the same thing in two different locations, two different bodies, serving two masters. That could have the potential to change or alter the perspective on a matter. Use prestige of office for private gain. You can't testify as a private individual at a public hearing on, say, a wetlands permit or something, and say, I sit on the planning commission, so I know what I'm talking about. Because when you're doing that, you're invoking your status, your prestige of office. And some of you might be surprised that you have prestige of office, but you do. And you can't invoke it for anyone else's or your own private gain. Can't use confidential information in official capacity for your own benefit or another. I think that's pretty obvious. Can't participate in a matter in which you or relatives have a legal or economic interest. Yeah, blasted. I'm just gonna do this manually. There we go. So talking about that last one, business interests. Can't hold an interest in a business that has or is negotiating a contract with the local governmental body that you're working for. You can't be employed by a business that is negotiating a contract, and can't represent any party for a contingent fee before a local body, because that gives you an economic interest in the outcome of the proceeding. This applies to qualifying relative, spouse, parent, child, sibling. Subject to certain limited exceptions, you can't gifts for more than $20 from someone who created by a governmental entity that you work for. And after you've left government service, if you ever do, you can't participate in, you can't represent someone in connection with a matter that you participated significantly in while employed by the local government. Now, that doesn't mean that you had to be the decision maker with respect to that matter, nor does it mean that you were just tangentially, but you have to have been involved substantively. Tough thing to define, but that's what the Ethics Commission looks at as to whether this would be a prohibited conflict of interest. Recusal, when is it appropriate to do so? Example, spouse has a development project that is coming to the commission for site plan approval. Well, that seems like fairly obvious. And if you have to recuse, you do not participate in any part of the matter, and disclosure without recusal is not sufficient in that such situation where you have a conflict of interest. Distinguish that from the donut example I gave earlier. About ethics, the body to contact is the State Ethics Commission. They have folks who are able to answer these questions. They do it all the time. They've got lots and lots of published advisory opinions that go into the really nitty-gritty about different types of provisions or different types of conflicts and whatnot. So you can really find a lot there. Right now we've got a quick test. Choose all that apply. Authority to regulate to protect public health, safety, and welfare. Yes. The basis for zoning and other land use regulations. Yep, we talked about that. Limited to the power to arrest a criminal suspect. No, it's not limited to that. That is a police power, but it's not limited to. And delegated by the state, county, and municipalities. Yeah, That from me and from Keith. Development rights vest when construction is complete. I mean, they will have been vested by that time, but that's not the test. The applicant obtains government approval on a preliminary plan. Well, in what jurisdiction? Maryland. Yeah, Maryland is a late vesting state. This would work in an early vesting state, but in Maryland, you need more. You need both the permit and you need to have started work. Applicant has a building permit and has made visible changes to the property, thereby giving notice to the public. That's kind of, paraphrase of the standard. Public notices is printed in a local newspaper. Well, no, I mean, public notice bears on this, but you still need your permit. You still need to have done work. Right. A regulatory taking occurs when your lawyer says so. Now, that's not as ridiculous as it sounds, because unless you can get into one of these categorical boxes, but no, that's not an actual answer. Taking occurs when use is not permitted under current rules. Well, no. Just because a particular use is not permitted doesn't mean that all uses are not permitted. You don't necessarily get to do the use that you want, as long as there are other economically viable uses available. A regulation removes all property. Yeah, it has to be a total take. We're talking about 100% or really close to it. When it is determined that a variance is needed. Well, not really. That's not like a takings test. Often you need a variance in order to avoid a taking, but it doesn't necessarily mean that without a variance, there will be a taking. In the example we had with the barn, maybe it would have been there. Maybe you can't build a house on that parcel if you don't get a variance in some way, but that's not part of the constitutional test as to whether something constitutes a taking or not. An unconstitutional exaction occurs when action has nothing to do with the governmental purpose for the exaction. Yeah, that's the rational nexus test that we talked about with the people walking along the beach, and the impact of the exaction far exceeds the governmental purpose for the exaction. That too would be an exaction. That's the rough proportionality test. You have to compare what is the impact of the condition, how does it compare to the impact of the project itself. See, there is both a rational nexus and rough proportionality between the exaction and the governmental purpose. Well, that's the opposite. That's when you're okay. If you satisfied both of those, then there is no taking. Hearing before a Board of Appeals must be recorded. Yeah. Held in the evening. No, not necessarily. Have testimony taken under oath. Yeah. Include the recorded vote or failure to vote of each member. Yep. Those are that kind of formal procedures that apply to the Board of Appeals. Counties and municipalities must enact public official ethics rules for the following. Lobbying. Yep, we mentioned that. Financial disclosure. Yep. Conflicts of interest. D is the answer. All above. Ex parte communications from a party to a Board of Appeals member should be encouraged to gain additional information for decision making. Well, maybe you get more information, but it triggers all these unfairness concerns. So no, that's not right. Always require recusal of the board member. No, ex parte communications don't. You have to disclose and put it on the record. That's number C. Oh boy, that must be the answer. Be kept confidential under one or more executive privileges. That's D. No, that's not the way it works. There may be privileges that you deal with in your service on the Board of Appeals or on the planning, but no privilege is going to cover ex parte communication. And with that, we're all done.
Any questions here? Question, talking about the what if you on a city planning commission work with?
what capacity do you work for the county?
Economic development.
And
Yeah. I don't think it is.
And you would you would not, though, if it's municipal, there would be no conflict, direct conflict, because the municipality would have its own, planning, zoning, land use authority. But if you are, I mean, there might be a prestige of office issue here, or maybe something that it affects your view, and it wouldn't be a direct conflict of interest, but there would be one that I think if you had asked me that and I'm your lawyer, I would go look at ethics commission opinions to see if that issue would come up, because there are hundreds of them, and you can just search for particular position and you get all of these variations of served as a planning commissioner and a forester, served as a planning commissioner and a member of the city, commissioner or whatnot. So yeah, I mean, there's that constitutional provision that says you can't hold two offices of profit, and what constitutes an office of profit is itself a whole world of constitutional inquiry.
One other question, and everybody keeps asking me about this, they're like, this one. What if one of the people on the planning commission is a real estate person involved?
So repeat the question so that we get the audience out there to hear.
So the question, what if one of
the planning commissioners is a real estate agent or broker that does a lot of business?
Well, I mean, they certainly would have to recuse themselves, of course, when we're talking about any issue that comes to the planning commission involving a property that they're involved in. But I think I don't think there's a categorical exclusion of realtors or real estate agents from service on planning commission.
You often see, in terms of planning commissions, engineering firms, or someone from an engineering firm wants to provide service to and you benefit from having that expertise, that professional knowledge in that profession on your planning commission.
Right.
But, and same thing with architects, but they can't and shouldn't be, they should recuse themselves if they're involved in a particular project that is coming before the planning or the Board of Appeals or the Historic Commission or whatever, because they have a financial interest in it. But outside of that, you benefit from having that professional knowledge at your disposal as a commission as a whole.
Let me follow up on this gentleman's question. So the profession of real estate would not be a categorically like an exclusionary factor for being a member of the planning commission. Only if they had an interest in something that was going on in town or sold a lot of property in town. Would that be like a correct?
Can you?
Oh, sorry.
So the question is, and again, gets back to the question of, if you have a planning commission member that is a real estate agent or a real estate broker or involved in real estate, does that categorically exclude them from being on the planning commission or board of appeals?
Yeah, again, I don't think so.
The answer, I don't believe so. I've seen it too many times. And now, as a planning commissioner, and I've seen this also as a situation, and as other members of the planning commission are upset that this one particular person has to recuse himself because they seem to have the only business in town, and they're recusing themselves like 75% of the cases because of this. Now, in those instances, you probably ought to have a conversation. My recommendation is, as a planning commissioner, if you have planning staff, talk to the planning staff. If you don't have planning staff, talk to the town manager, or God forbid, you talk to the mayor. But someone needs to talk to the real estate person and say, look, we love your service, but be honest with you, we need to find a better volunteer job for you in serving our community, because people participate in 75% of the cases that are coming there. We're missing your resource as a benefit elsewhere. So let's find a better position, and they may work out that outside of the ethics, but actually work through. Here's how I would do it. Let's go to this gentleman.
I think we skipped
You
it.
said on your slide that was required by feedback to board proceedings to the front of the board of appeals. I know the Open Meetings Act does not mandate a local
No,
legislative body to report, physically
Right.
report. You certainly have to keep minutes.
right. No,
Is there another provision that you cite?
Record the answer. I think record the votes. That's what you were saying.
Oh, recording the minutes.
yeah,
As opposed, but
Right.
to me, it would be a bit crazy not to actually record on a tape the proceedings so that transcription can be done.
yeah. And when you, the point is that even if it's not required to videotape or audio tape an entire meeting of the Board of Appeals, it makes sense to do that. It certainly does in terms of open meeting compliance, because it makes it much easier to determine, at least for the people who are adjudicating those open meetings complaints, to see what happened. And oftentimes that helps you as the local government council to show that, look, we got nothing to hide. Here's what happened. Should we, it's 3:20.
Yeah, and we're going to finish this. I want to give a chance for the people in the virtual audience. So there's two
I took
questions.
pictures of them.
One was, can the Board of the Planning Commission Board of Appeals adopt their own code of ethics or the American Planning Association Code of Ethics?
I think that's going to depend on their authority
Right.
as
The
established
American
under.
Planning Association is for professional planners per se. It's not really as relevant to the planning volunteer commissions. So that's one. And then the next one is, I'm an architect in a firm, and firm that does have contracts with the jurisdiction that I serve. I was assured that I was not in an issue when I agreed to serve. It sounds like I might have an issue. Again, our recommendation is, if you're working on a project and it's that project is going to the Planning Commission or the Board of Appeals, and you're on that board, you have a financial interest in that particular case. My recommendation is recuse yourself and step out of the room in that particular one. So I guess the answer is recuse, walk out, come back. Okay, I think we're.
One more, as far as the person who teaches themselves, did it make sense for that person to be maybe the chair of the commission?
If they're going to keep recusing themselves, well, you're going to have a vice chair stepping into their shoes an awful lot. It may not be the way to run a government, but
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, small towns, you have very few people that volunteer, but it comes to the question of the effectiveness of the organization if a person's recusing themselves a lot. So, thank you, Anna. I'm going to now turn it over to Tracy Gordy, our director on the Lower Eastern Shore, and we are now moving forward rapidly into the next part of our.
we've gotten through the morass. Kevin,
Okay. So you're Tracy, and I'm.
this. Remember,
Yes.
It's been years. That's it. I was just appointed legal counsel to the Board of Appeals in Charles County. And then I represented municipalities. So
Yeah.
it's these days.
Wow.
I just heard you before the Board of
Okay,
Appeals.
so we're going to start fast to get it
How is that?
back time-wise. So bear with me here. We're going to talk first about the comprehensive plan.
Maybe.
As we start this part of the course, this module, it's helpful to remind ourselves about the underpinnings of planning. What are we trying to achieve? The public values that we're planning, that we're seeking to address.
I'm glad. Thank you very
The
much. for
most
saying that. I
fundamental
appreciate
value is to protect public health, safety, and welfare. That's the overarching purpose of planning. And because land use planning and regulation are an exercise of local police power, all planning and related regulations must be justified on the basis of promoting health, safety, and welfare. Over time, we've added additional values that we've incorporated into the planning process, such as built environment, transparent process, public participation, and so forth. Under Planning Commission responsibilities with respect to the comprehensive plan is the major responsibility of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission has the function and duty to prepare the plan for the jurisdiction and then to present that plan to the local legislative body or governing body for adoption. The roles and responsibilities and the way in which the plan is adopted can somewhat differ between non-charter counties and municipalities and charter counties. But in non-charter counties and municipalities, the major responsibility and formal role of the planning commissioners is outlined in the land use article. For those of you that have been around a while, like me, you're used to hearing Article 66B. That was the former 66B, and how to prepare your comprehensive plan. Once the planning commission's created, the planning commission has the function to prepare the plan for the jurisdiction and then to present that plan for consideration and adoption to the local elected body. In charter counties, the planning commission's role can be somewhat different. It's determined through the local charter process, however that's defined in charter counties. I'm going to speak a little bit about the 12 visions. Back in 1992, were expanded, ultimately up to 12. The areas that it covers, the interrelated planning issues, are listed in this slide: housing, economic development, sustainability, resource conservation. In Maryland, when we prepare a comprehensive plan, our comprehensive plan is supposed to be guided by these 12 visions. And the 12 were actually adopted in 2009. That's when we got to we started, like I said, in 92 at 7. Now we're up to 12 in 2009. They are the foundation for our land use planning in Maryland. And these planning, and they need to be incorporated into the comprehensive plan. I often tell people, not just listed like they are on this slide, and they're list the area of concentration, but in a meaningful way into the comprehensive plan and somehow folded into your goals and objectives of the plan. Certainly. Because we went from 7, then we went to, what was it, 9, Chuck?
The answer to the question is they all change a little bit.
Let me repeat the question for the audience. The question was asked here, which ones were added from 1992 when we started with 7, which ones were added to get where we were in 2012 with 12 of them?
Yeah, and so the short answer is they all changed a little bit, and because they reworded them and they try to modernize them a little bit. I do know that quality of life and sustainability wasn't at all in the previous ones. Stewardship, I don't believe itself was. And so housing, economic development, environmental protection, they were all in there. Implementation, I believe, is in there. Transportation was in there. Community design is also new. So many of these particular visions are wrapped up into a lot of different planning concepts that have been out there. And the smart growth era, they actually identified, I think, 10 different principles of smart growth, which this built upon to identify the 12. But these are very Maryland specific.
I was going to say, so these are more Maryland approach versus like an international or a national approach to planning. This is something that, you know, Maryland said, we're gonna be extra special and this is what it means to us.
Yeah, there was a task force that was constituted by the governor, I don't know, 10 years ago, whatever it is. It's been a long time now. And they revisited it. And so they recommended these into the General Assembly to address and make the previous planning visions, again, more relevant to Maryland. And so, yeah.
I think it started under Governor Glendenning.
Yes,
It was all part of the big blanket of smart growth, and then smart growth and the visions, and then the smart growth principles, right. And all of that was under the blanket of smart growth.
Yeah,
I'll have a nice slide that kind of
we actually have we have a timeline that's on our website, and we can, I think it's 1992 was when the first set of visions were adopted.
That's correct.
And so about 10 years later is when they started to revisit it. And now we're, you know, another 10 years or so beyond that, or so 25, 30 years now since we started this whole process. So, yeah.
Certainly. I'm sorry we couldn't specifically answer which ones, but. So getting to the comprehensive plan, when we talk about planning in a comprehensive way, planning is a process to establish and document and explain the community's vision. We often talk about the comprehensive plan. Kid wanted every this is by taking into account both past and present issues, as well as trends and opportunities for the future. And through the planning process, we establish goals, objectives, policies to help realize that vision. But the bottom line is the comprehensive plan and the tools that we use to implement the plan help us to get the comprehensive. Okay, Chuck, they're saying my audio is cutting in and out. So it's breaking up. Sorry, everyone. In the virtual world, is that better? If somebody can okay, they say it's better. Might have been my batteries. My batteries are tired. So you establish goals and objectives for the community. One of the things that you do in the comprehensive planning process is you take inventory of existing conditions and you look at what you have now, what's present with respect to population, demographics, your existing land use, your infrastructure, economy, natural resources, transportation, basically the whole kit and caboodle. And then you start to analyze. Once you create that existing inventory, you analyze and you determine, you know, this is what we have now, and is this where we want to be, or where do we want to be, and what measures do we need to take to make that happen? Then you start to identify the implementation strategies in the plan. You know, what do we have to do to actually put this plan into action? And that becomes your implementation element, and that's accomplished many ways through ordinances and documents, and also implementation recommendations in your comprehensive plan. The main thing that we tell people is that when you adopt this plan, you prepare and adopt this plan, the goal is not to just say, we worked for a year, we've been through this process, we did a great job, pat ourselves on the back and set the plan on the shelf, because that doesn't get you anywhere. You can have the best comprehensive plan in the universe, but if you don't follow it up with implementation regulations that implement what you have in the plan, then nothing that you have in that plan is actually going to come to fruition, because it's the implementation and the regulatory ordinances that are really what's going to put it into action. In addition, many of you have probably heard about annual reporting. And so a lot of people use the comprehensive plan as a tool to help develop their annual reports in the format and to kind of track their progress annually. And that's something that the Planning Commission is also very involved in. Going to touch a little bit on the required elements of a comprehensive plan. Again, in the land use article, these are mentioned. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is a listing of some of the required elements, the goals, the policies, visions, transportation, water resources element. The municipal growth element is specific only to municipalities, not to counties. Those of you in municipalities are familiar, that's one of the newer elements. It's been a few years now, but municipal growth and water resources came about at the same time. Municipal growth is the element that talks about municipalities where you want your future growth to occur, future annexation areas. That is an element that you work with in conjunction with your county to develop that element. Sensitive areas, and then mineral resources is a required element, but the reason we have optional beside it is because it only needs to be identified in the plan if you have an economically viable mineral industry. If you do not, then it's not required. Some additional required elements of the comprehensive plan we've listed here: land use, very important, community facilities. Again, fisheries has an asterisk because that only applies to tidal areas. If you have tidal areas in your communities, then it is required. Areas of critical state concern, and then a section where you provide recommendations for how to implement the plan in regulatory ways, and that's very important. One of the newer required elements that was not mandatory before was a housing element. If those of you that are aware, the law has changed and that has now switched to a mandatory requirement. Any plan that's updated after June 1st, 2020 is required to have a housing element. I would direct all of you to MDP's website because our unit has spent a lot of time working on a guidance document for housing element, and that would be something that I would recommend as a resource to you. We are also available to help with that and to answer questions on that. There's many other tools that can be utilized to implement the plan, but Chuck is going to touch on those in the next section. So I will move on to optional elements. With optional elements, these are things that are not required by the land use article to be in the comprehensive plan. But certainly if your jurisdiction feels that it's important and relevant to you, it would be important to include it. We've listed some examples of some of those that could be included. We also have jurisdictions that include historic preservation elements. If you have a jurisdiction that has a lot of heritage and historic character, and that's an important, could be important economic tool, could be important preservation tool, you want to have a section on that, that would be perfectly logical to include. And then the other thing that we've seen a lot of, especially here in the lower shore, which is mine and Keith's region, is that with having more and more storm events and coastal issues, we have a lot more jurisdictions now that are looking at including elements related to hazard mitigation, separate and distinct from the county hazard mitigation plan. Hazard mitigation, long-term resiliency, like a resiliency element, really important. Sea level rise, climate change, all of those sorts of things now are starting to come up as areas for optional elements. Yes. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And the question was for those of you on the internet was the nuisance flooding plan. And that is a requirement that has been accomplished by many jurisdictions, and that could easily fold into this, certainly. Okay. Talk about the comprehensive planning process. It's not easy. It's not easy. You need to obviously respond to a lot of different interest groups in your community. It needs to be inclusive. You need to be very, very aware of having a transparent process. You need to make sure that your plan is expressing the diversity of your community and the various viewpoints. But more important than your plan representing that is making sure that everybody has a voice to represent their viewpoint and to share. You know, everybody's perspective is different in a community, and it's really, really important to incorporate that. I mentioned earlier and touch on it now that there's a lot of different ways that a jurisdiction can update their comprehensive plan. In our region, we have a lot of small towns that don't have any planners on staff. We help them, but most of them have to look for grants to hire a consultant to update their comprehensive plan. That's probably our most common method for which a comprehensive plan gets updated. Even in our rural counties, that's usually the case, with even county planning staffs having qualified planners on. So it's seeking the funding, finding a professional consultant to help. It can be a combination of things. It can be the planning commission working with the consultant. It can be an appointed group working with the planning commission. It can be any number of things, but that can be determined by your individual jurisdictions and the way in which you think it would best suit your community. On the comprehensive planning process, it needs to, as I mentioned, to be as inclusive as possible, to have community outreach, to look at all the different elements, to look at all the different advocacy groups and the stakeholder groups. One of the things that we've really learned in COVID, obviously, is that we can conduct, you know, sessions like this, where we can have lots of people out there listening in and people here in person. I've noticed that even in our smaller communities, people are using social media more for these types of events. They're using online surveys, they're using online forums, they're doing virtual meetings where people are able to, you know, post comments like people are doing right here. And that actually is, even though the transition initially was difficult from a technological standpoint for a lot of these rural counties and towns, it ended up being a benefit in the long run because we found a lot of different ways to be able to reach people. Yes. So the question was, wouldn't it even be beneficial to be more proactive, to reach out and establish all of that in the beginning of the process? And I would say absolutely. I think one of the most important things that a jurisdiction can do is to identify the various stakeholder groups. That's very important. And define representatives that are willing to represent those groups, and define different means, like you said, be proactive. You could hold a forum before you even start your comprehensive plan process and let people know that it's coming. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that can be made is that you work very, very hard as a planning commissioner and you get through all these meetings and you've really been genuinely trying to produce the plan that's best for your community, and you get to the end and all of a sudden everybody comes forward and says, we didn't know anything about this, and we have all these comments and we have all this stuff to say, and it's almost as if you're starting all over again. So I think the more outreach you can do early on and the more inclusive you can be early on, the better you will be in the long run. I want to talk a little bit about the comp plan work sessions. During these sessions, and as this slide indicates, these are some of the things that the Planning Commission would be looking at, but also I want to talk about the difference between the public hearing process, the public meetings, and the work sessions. I think that we all know what a public hearing is, and we know that that's a very formal advertised process. But I think sometimes there's some confusion between a public meeting and a work session. And one of the things that we talk to planning commissioners about quite a bit is that as you're working through the comprehensive planning process, whether you're working just with the planning commission and staff, whether you're working with a consultant, you have a lot of work to do, and it's a very long process. Most of these comprehensive plan updates are a year in the making, and that's if you're meeting once or twice a month. So what we tell people is that you can conduct work sessions, they're public, you're subject to open meetings law, but you don't have to entertain comment at work sessions. The purpose of work sessions is to get work done. You might want to discuss a consultant's draft chapter. You might want, or element, you might want to discuss, you might want to have an expert come in, an engineer or an architect, or somebody that's expert in an area where you have a local issue that you want to address. Those kinds of work sessions, you're actually getting stuff done. The public can be there to hear it, observe it, but they don't necessarily need to comment in all of your work sessions, because quite frankly, if you open your work sessions to all public comment, do you think you're ever going to get any work done? So, there's times when you can have planning commission work sessions to get work done, make them public, and people can view and listen. And then there's times when you have public meetings where you allow for public comment and input. And that can be all part of this process at various times. And to have these work sessions to start identifying key issues and start looking at drafts of the plan and talking about them. Coordination. I want to talk a little bit about coordination. With comprehensive planning, you have internal and external coordination. If you are a municipality or county and you have a lot of different departments within your government, like public works and education and planning, and I can't think of any, transportation, you want to have input from all of the different groups within your organization, as well as also have input, if you're a municipality, from your county. There's going to be issues that you're going to need to coordinate on. There's going to be issues that you need to address. We have situations where we have municipalities that share a wastewater treatment plant. If you share a wastewater treatment plant, then you need to be talking to that other municipality about what you're including in your plan with respect to that shared facility. So coordination between school planning, water resource planning, transportation planning, all of that is very important, just not only within your organization, but between your sister governments and also between state and local government as well. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later as to the role that Maryland Department of Planning can help with this comprehensive plan update. And then also we have interjurisdictional coordination, which I just briefly touched on, which again, when you have neighboring jurisdictions or government agencies that you may need to coordinate with in the planning and update of your plan, there may be linkages to transportation. As we all know, transportation systems don't stop at borders to jurisdictions. You may have school systems that are shared. You may have wastewater treatment or water treatment facilities that are shared. All of those things will require coordination between governments and between agencies within a government. So when we get to the point where the Planning Commission, I've said, has responsibility with drafting the plan, the Planning Commission does not approve the plan in most cases. The Planning Commission drafts the plan, oversees that the draft is ready. At that point, in almost all cases, we start what is known as the 60-day review, for short. That's what we call it, 60-day review. And that is when the jurisdiction will send their draft plan that they have endorsed to the Maryland Department of Planning's state clearinghouse. State clearinghouse is housed within our agency. And at that point, the state clearinghouse sends out the draft plan to all of our sister state agencies for review and comment. Within that 60-day period, normally the regional planner for that, whatever jurisdiction has submitted it, our regional planners take the lead on that project, and we assemble, we review it ourselves and make comment, but we also assemble all the state agency comments. And then we prepare a letter that goes back to the jurisdiction that incorporates all the state agency comments. At that point in time, it is at the discretion of the jurisdiction, the county or the municipality, to decide what, if any, comments that we've provided they want to incorporate into their final draft plan. Do they have this question always comes up, do they have the option to ignore all of our comments? They absolutely do. Do we want that? We absolutely don't. But are we also in the position where we're trying to in any way take over the local process or strong arm a jurisdiction into putting our comments in? No. What we provide back to the jurisdiction are ways in which we think the plan could be strengthened and or benefited. And in some ways, and sometimes things are overlooked that we might mention. But I will also say our hope is that we will be coordinating with you again proactively at the beginning of the process, so that neither of us is going to be surprised at the end of the process. And that's something I also, again, like I said, I will touch on in a minute about what our role could be. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the question was, when the state clearinghouse comments come back, does it go back to the planning commission before it goes to the legislative body? So our response will be back to the planning commission, or sometimes it's the planning director submitting on behalf of the planning commission. Our comments go back, and those comments go directly to the planning commission for consideration. The planning commission determines what, if any, changes they would like to make to the draft document. And then the planning commission is required at that time to hold a public hearing on the draft document. In the public hearing, they receive any comments. Once again, as a result of those comments they might receive at public hearing, they can determine if they want to incorporate or change or edit the plan any further. And at the point that they're satisfied with a final draft plan, that is when they forward it to the elected officials. Now, the elected officials will also have the benefit of our letter and comment, and that's something I want to touch on. So once it gets to the elected official stage, the elected official, depending on the local charter, it is not required per the state land use article that the elected officials hold a public hearing. That is their option, or like I said, if their charter requires it. If there was a bill passed in 2015, House Bill 919, Senate Bill 551, that if in fact the local legislative body opted to modify, remand, or disapprove the plan that was submitted by the Planning Commission, they could only do so after holding a public hearing to modify the plan. If they remanded or disapproved the plan, they had to hold, they must hold that public hearing before submitting a new revised plan back to the Planning Commission. And then the Planning Commission would reconsider those comments, and then it would go back again. Yes, yes. And before we get to the first Q&A, I talked a little bit about comprehensive plan assistance, and this is a slide about MDP. I want to make sure I'm up on my slides, about MDP and the role we might play. For those of you that have been familiar with Maryland Department of Planning for a while, we do have a series of guidance documents called Models and Guidelines. If you're interested in the topic list of those or getting copies of those, I would recommend contacting your regional planner for your region. We have a wide variety of issues. One of those is updating the comprehensive plan, adopting a comprehensive plan. But also, one of the things that we started doing about maybe 5 or 6 years ago is if a jurisdiction in our region contacted us and said, we're getting ready to start our comp plan process, how can you assist us? We will put together a representative from the relevant state agencies like Department of Natural Resources, Maryland Department of the Environment, Department of Housing Community Development, anything that's relevant to your community. And we will have those individuals look at your plan in advance, and we will arrange a meeting with you in your jurisdiction, and we will give you on the front end some of the things that the state is interested in your jurisdiction, or some of the concerns we might have, or some of the things that we think might need to be addressed. Because what we found was happening was we weren't involved on the front end. You would spend, a year-long process to do a draft plan. We would get it, and then we would provide you with pages and pages of comments that, when you think about it, makes sense to say, well, why didn't we have these when we started the process? And we could have considered all of this. So we've reversed that. But again, that is your choice. That is your option. If you would like for us to be involved on the front end and arrange a meeting like that, contact your regional planner. We will do that. And it's just very informal. It's just a discussion. And we can kind of highlight what some of the areas of interest are from the state side that you may or may not want to address in your comprehensive plan. There's a lot on there.
Got a lot of questions there? Okay, we're going to go to any questions in the audience first. Okay. Yes, sir. So Keith and I in our camp, we do a lot of grant writing for our smaller jurisdictions. One of our more successful opportunities has been block grant, but you do have to be a low to moderate income community. You have to qualify at that level first. And there's planning grant money available annually for that. That's been one source. But then also
I don't know if you have experience with DNR's Grants Gateway. And with Grants Gateway, it's a little bit trickier, but if you decide that in your comprehensive plan update, you do want to start to address issues such as sea level rise, climate change, resiliency, that can fold into comprehensive planning for Grants Gateway.
So there was one question on here about the ethics conversation we had before. And again, I think it goes back to the issue of looking at the resources that we're going to send you on the link. Go to the Ethics Commission and get that's searchable, and you can really find a lot of relevant information to your specific questions on the ethics. So the one question that's in here is, how often is a comprehensive required to be updated?
10 years.
Okay, and that's the last question we have here. So without further ado, I am going to turn it back to Tracy. And oh, we got one more question here.
Our region is Talbot County, Dorchester, Somerset, Worcester, Wycomico. And temporarily right now we are covering St. Mary's County and Calvert. Okay, so now we're going to touch on Planning Commission roles and responsibilities. Obviously, it's important to mention that you're a part of a team, as I think I've already addressed, that, you know, not just Planning Commission members, but you're dealing with administration, staff, you're dealing with any planning professionals you may hire. Sometimes you're often dealing with legislators, state agencies, including our department, Board of Appeals, court system if things get appealed. Planning commissioners play a major role in determining the future land use and in implementing the jurisdiction's comprehensive plans. Planning commissions have both formal roles and informal roles depending on the makeup of that jurisdiction. And that's provided through their codes, their charters, their bylaws, their general practices. It can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some of the primary responsibilities, though, of the commission are to, as I've mentioned many times, create the comprehensive plan, incorporate the 12 visions into the plan, and then to also help create the regulatory ordinances to implement the plan, such as your zoning ordinance, which is, you know, crucially important, and your subdivision regulations, your environmental regulations, and so forth, any development regs that you may have. In developing the comprehensive plan, the Planning Commission follows a process. That process involves all the stakeholders, which we address, the various interest groups, whether it be individual residents, businesses, the environmental community, transportation, any of the professional trades. You conduct your meetings and your hearings to receive input into the plan. And we touched on the difference between a public hearing, which is an advertised formal process where testimony is provided, versus a public meeting that's subject to Open Meetings Act, where people are allowed to speak, versus work sessions. Again, all of it's subject, I don't want Adam to freak out, all of it's subject to open meetings law. we don't want to not say that. You work with the staff in the formal public hearings, the informal sessions, such as the work sessions. You develop strategies, you develop implementation recommendations to be included in the plan. You're responsible for coordinating the 60-day review, making sure you don't hold your public hearing before you receive your 60-day review comments from the state, preparing your final draft on or your final document, which is your draft plan to submit to your elected officials. And then sometimes we will even have like the PC chair or Planning Commission chair or members come to the elected officials meeting when it's presented to the elected officials, and even provide testimony on the process that the Planning Commission conducted and their views and opinions on the plan, or any comments that they've received on the plan. And I think that's beneficial to the elected officials as well. Something I didn't touch on that's come up at these training sessions before, and I think it's good to bring it to light right now, and it's not really in this presentation, is that one of the mistakes I think you don't want to make as a planning commissioner is that you don't want to exclude the elected officials from the process as you're going through it, Because if you're never checking in with the elected officials and ultimately they're approving the comprehensive plan, it would be good if periodically someone is giving them an update or maybe even some drafts on the document so that you know that you both are thinking along the same lines. What you don't want to do is be thinking as a planning commission that you are operating within the realm of expectation of your elected officials and get through the whole process and find out that it is far from what they expected and that it's not going to go the direction that you hoped that it would. So I think it's good to have a check-in, maybe a quarterly check-in, maybe provide a draft, maybe talk to them a little bit, just to make sure that you're thinking along the same lines, and because you don't want to run into that at the end of the process. Non-charter counties and municipalities have a advisory role as well. Again, like I said, it depends on the way in which the charter is established, whether there's a charter or not. You may be advisory on zoning text amendments, zoning ordinances, subdivision regulations, plan unit developments, other development regulations. And when I say advisory, meaning that the Planning Commission will review it and look for issues regarding consistency or make recommendations, but they don't actually approve any of those ordinances. It's always a recommendation to the local elected officials. In other cases, there is an approval role for non-charter counties and municipalities. Again, depending on the way in which the local regulations are written, oftentimes you'll see that planning commission members have the responsibility for approving subdivisions. That is the case in many jurisdictions. So you can see that they will look at and review site plans and subdivisions and may have approving authority. Or in other cases, they may look at, review, and make recommendations to the elected officials for approval. Again, depending on what authority is given by or delegated by the non-charter county and municipality, and how that is enumerated in the provisions. So for charter counties, the approval role, again, it is determined by the charter ordinance. In some charter counties, authority for approval of rezoning, special exceptions, and variances is given to an administrative hearing officer, while other times it's given to a planning advisory board. This section of the course is a little bit hard to predict because it does really depend on each jurisdiction and the way in which the regulatory ordinances are written and the way in which their charters are written. We have some jurisdictions where a variance and a special exception doesn't get to go to the Board of Appeals until the Planning Commission makes a review and recommendation on it as far as consistency with the comprehensive plan. Then we have other jurisdictions where it goes directly to the board and the Planning Commission isn't involved at all. There's situations where you may have a subdivision or a site plan that requires a special exception or a variance in order to happen. So you've got both bodies involved. You've got the Planning Commission reviewing it for one level of review and the Board of Appeals for another level review. So it can get a little complicated, but if it's spelled out properly in the regulatory ordinances and in the charter, it should be rather easy to follow. Regarding meetings and public input, while we covered this, earlier, it's important to reiterate that the importance of open, transparent, and inclusive meetings. I can't say that enough. Also, to have various platforms for ways in which people can participate. Not everybody can get to a meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. People work. Not everybody can get to a meeting at 6 o'clock at night. So, when you recognize that maybe you're not getting the input or you're not getting the representation that you would like or desire, look for innovative ways to gather input. Look for ways to create an online forum. Look for ways to create a survey. Look for other ways for people. Post drafts online. Let people respond to drafts. Just look for any way that you can find to get people to participate and be a partner in this community update. I mentioned that work sessions are normally conducted when the Planning Commission wants to get work done. They want to address a specific proposal or a project. It is not the same as a public hearing process. It's time for the planning staff and planning professionals to present information, to entertain questions, to have meaningful discussion. And while they're open to the public, normally public testimony is not something that's provided at a work session. Public hearings, much different, sworn in, they're advertised in advance. People are given, they're conducted in a fair way. People are given time to say their comments. That can be a timed period. Doesn't mean that somebody gets to talk for half an hour, but at least they do have the opportunity to speak. Chuck, do you want me to hold questions to the end or address them now? Who cover? Certainly. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I'm actually getting ready to touch on that.
The one question that was in the virtual world is the contact information for the Baltimore City. And I think right now, Joe Griffiths is filling in for Baltimore City. We are hopefully going to hire a Central Maryland planner soon. So I would say for Mary that joseph.griffiths@maryland.com, or send it to me and I'll get it to the person that can address your question regarding that. 1 second, I will move this thing back and I'll get you back to your control here. Try again. There you go.
Okay. And also to Mary, if you have any problem, Mary, you can also just email me. It's Tracy, TRACEY .Gordy, GORDY @Maryland, all spelled out, .gov. And I will put you in touch with the correct person. One of the things I was going to say, so you're very timely about this slide, which is a site plan, is that in looking at the roles and responsibilities of Planning Commission members and Board of Appeals members, it's really important to know and understand in advance the materials that you're going to be making decisions on at that meeting. And the best way in which to do that is through staff reports. Now, that said, we have a lot of small jurisdictions that don't have staff to be able to do staff reports. And so I'm not trying to say that if you don't do that, you can't, if you don't have a staff report, you can't do your job. I'm not trying to say that, because there are some small towns that just can't produce staff reports, but you're not from a small town. So I will address your concern. Staff reports are very, very important. It gives you the information that you need in advance of the meeting to be able to inform yourself prior to the meeting of the kinds of questions that you need to ask. If you're not getting that material in advance, and this is just generally what I was going to say, if you're not getting that material in advance of the meeting, you're not going to be well advised, and it's going to take twice as long to be able to talk about that project or that development project or ask those questions. I personally can't speak to what a local jurisdiction's procedure or process is. So I don't want to say that someone is wrong because they don't allow for comments in advance. But it would seem to me, and Adam, if you could chime in if I'm wrong, it is not an issue where you have any kind of outside quorum or any decision being made. These are just staff reports you're receiving that you have questions about the project that you need clarification in advance of the meeting. I wouldn't see a harm in that.
One of the things that we are cautious about is why we're hopefully speaking loud enough to hear is that
one of the things that we're always cautious about is email chains with staff and copy all.
Mm-hmm.
There's good and bad about that, but what you're doing, and you do that, is you're conducting business outside of a public forum. So it's only those people that are on the email chain that you're asking the question or trying to get information. And that's why staff say, don't email everybody. If you have a question, send it to your staff member. We'll investigate it. We'll send out the response to everyone, but we're not going to create these essential meetings, virtual meetings that are outside of the open meetings law. So that's where staff usually get, the willies when people start to do these, oh, I think we ought to do this. And someone chimes in, oh, you should do that. You're not in a meeting. You're on an email chain. You've already made some decisions, or you've influenced your decisions of other people outside of the public. Don't do that.
So I think that when I was referring to quorum, that's what I meant. When you have, when it would essentially constitute a quorum, even in an email, you're conducting business. If it's you as a planning commission member receiving your materials and you have clarifications you need, and you're contacting the staff person, that's staff to the planning commission, to ask for those clarifications, that's not a violation of open meetings. So I'm assuming that the staff person that expressed the concern about these kinds of comments going back and forth is concerned about the open meetings and the perception that could be made. We staff a lot of small towns and help with their planning commissions, and we often will get a call or email and say, well, we got your staff report. I have a question about this. There's not a problem with us responding to that. So as long as you're careful about not doing what Chuck just described, I think you would be fine. But it is very important to have the material transmitted in advance. It is important to have the time to absorb all of it so that you are prepared for the meeting, so that you can ask the important questions. Because if that's not given to you to the night of the meeting, it's near impossible for you to sort through all of that, get your mind wrapped around this project, and ask what needs to be asked to be able to do the job, quite frankly, that you're expected to do. Okay. And then my last slide. And we could talk an hour just on the septic bill, which we won't. So I'm just going to touch on it slightly. In 2012, the Sustainable Growth and Agricultural Preservation Act was passed, and it asked for local jurisdictions to identify areas or tiers where new subdivisions could be served by either on-site septic or public sewer systems. This deals only with sewer, not water. And it deals only with residential development, not non-residential development. So these tiers are based upon what you have outlined in your comprehensive plan largely, but they're also based on zoning. They're based on your comprehensive water and sewer plan and any agricultural policies that you may have adopted. In order for jurisdictions to allow new subdivisions and outside of the areas served by public sewer, you had to have a tier map adopted by December the 31st, 2012. This is major subdivisions, not minor. So the process for initial adoption of the tier maps was flexible. The maps can be adopted by an executive or administrative decision, but it does have to be a public process. Many of our tier maps in our rural areas went through Planning Commission recommendation before it went to elected officials for adoption, and that's one of the reasons why we include this slide in here. But we also include it because if you are on a Planning Commission that does review and offer either an approval or recommendation on subdivision activity, then you should be very much aware of your tier map and if your jurisdiction adopted one or if they did not. If your jurisdiction did not adopt a tier map, then they are not permitted to do major subdivision on septic. That was one of the, the carrot and the stick. That was the stick if you didn't adopt. So the Planning Commission has a role when it comes to reviewing subdivisions, and particularly ones in what's called a tier 3, which are those that allow for major subdivisions on septic. So any subdivision, major subdivision in a tier 3 has to be reviewed through a public hearing by the Planning Commission, whether or not that body is tasked with major subdivision review or not. So that's something you should be aware of. And as part of the local review, the Planning Commission shall consider the cost of providing services, government services to that subdivision based upon the impacts that it will have. And that concludes my presentation with our little quiz up next. That's true. Okay, so I will tell you on what my 17-year-old always tells me. If there's an all of the above, always check it. Okay, so a comprehensive plan is a reflection of A, B, C, or D. My 17-year-old's right. That's what he says. I can't tell you, but that's what he says. Next question. The number of planning visions to be addressed in a comprehensive plan is, that's correct, C12. The comprehensive plan process should involve, there you go again, all the above. And a comprehensive plan is required to be reviewed every 10 years. And I wanted to add one more thing. Somebody asked the question online about the 10-year review. Keep in mind that what it actually says is that the comprehensive plan shall be reviewed and, if necessary, updated every 10 years. If you haven't had anything change to speak of in your community and you don't feel a need to update the plan for whatever reason, you can review the plan and decide that there's not a need to update it, submit a letter to the elected officials. If they agree and concur, that can be sent to notify MDP, and you can say, we did do a review of the current plan and we have decided that update isn't needed at this time, and that constitutes your 10-year review. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to go blistering fast here because I have got my last section here. Let's see here. When was the last time Baltimore City's plan was updated? Mary, I don't have your answer to that question. Again, email me and I will follow up with you. Baltimore City's, like some of the charter counties, is a little bit different than others. So, and also they update elements of it, and there is no enforcement provision under these things. I mean, there's no funding that's withheld. It's just kind of peer pressure when people need to be updating beyond the 10 years. So there's no enforcement, unfortunately, that. I think Baltimore City is in the process of updating their plan and getting public input. I think they are too. Again, we'll follow up on that. And so I'm going to really, the last bit of this is dealing with growth management tools. And again, I'm going to be fast. So I warn you on this. It's a shame. I'm always the last one and get short into the stick of this stuff. But this is where the most fun is, because this is where the rubber hits the road on this. Okay, talked about zoning a lot already. So zoning, you know, hopefully this is obviously, it's dealing with uses, heights, massing, in terms of the special exceptions, that type of thing. There are standards that are in place that I recommend that you develop, that like traffic, impervious surface, so that if it's a residential area and you want a non-residential use, the comparability of those two is there the same, regardless of the special exception. I also encourage you to be very mindful. Special exceptions are not special. They're conditional uses, and people think when you use the word special exception, which I hate that term, because it sounds like they're getting something special. They're not. It meets the criteria. It's what's historically been called special exception. It's really conditional use. If they meet the criteria, you're hard pressed not to approve it. So be mindful of that. Typical zoning ordinance, you color in the different areas, different categories, intensities, density standards. This is typical Euclidean zoning. You heard about that earlier. Okay, Euclidean zoning has been the historical practice. Mixed use is becoming the more modern, but we're really going back to the old days. I live in Frederick City. Frederick City, 300 years old. It had mixed use a long time ago. It's really a more efficient use of land, particularly in compact areas. You have to think about your impacts and all of that, but mixed use is really creates great community and environment. Overlay zones are another component of zoning. You have environmental overlays, you have historic district overlays. Overlays tend to just give you a different process or protection or consideration for it. It typically doesn't give you a lot more uses per se. It might, but it allows you to recognize that there's a special process for this overlay zone. So it's very common. If you have historic districts, you put an overlay, it means you go to historic district commission. If you have an environmental area, you have a waterfront area, you have an overlay, you have special considerations that are unique to that part of it. One of the more modern types of zoning that's coming out is form-based zoning. It combines performance standards, what's called regulation plan. It incorporates uses together and allows for you for greater flexibility of actually what is allowed on the property, in the building, and you focus more on the perception from the public realm. What is this use look like from the public realm? So there's often a perspective of from the right of way or the road, how the building looks. Really don't care what's inside of it per se, but it's actually focusing more on what the massing and its relationship to the public right of way is. Subdivision is the second most powerful tool in your toolbox out of the local government. It is the division of land into one or more parcels. It often involves the dedication of public rights of way. It deals with sometimes the consolidation. When Adam talked about those redevelopment efforts, one of the reasons you do condemnation and takings is that you have to reassemble all those small little pieces of property back together so that you can redevelop it and then resell it to someone else. So subdivision, it can also be the reverse of a division of property. As part of the subdivision, you include standards for the street widths. What kind of street? Has it got like a curb, gutter, sidewalk, street trees, street lights? All the different components of that. It deals with the landscaping sometimes you have in there in terms of what kind of buffers you're going to have along there. And it obviously deals with utilities. A lot of your power lines, phone lines, cable, the internet now, they have put standards in place in your right of way so that there's enough room, a little bit of separation from each one of those different utilities, and they often design that so that it fits in there and so that your subdivision standards usually have an associated performance document that allows for the construction or the design of roads within there. All of this is built into a plat specifications so that you record it in the courthouse, the division of land, so that the land transfer can take place between this buyer and this seller along the way. That subdivision creates that legal document. Next category of implementation of a comprehensive plan is the water and sewer plan. Water and sewer plans are controlled by the county. So municipalities will actually do their own planning associated with a water and sewer plan, but it ultimately goes to the county to be incorporated into the county's plan. County submits it to Maryland Department of the Environment. Maryland Department of the Environment does the ultimate approval after approved at the county level. It has to be updated every 3 years. It includes capital improvements planning as well, capital improvements projects as well as the long-term planning. Typical things associated with a water and sewer plan, it really guides development. There are updates depending upon the county. Some do it quarterly, some do it piecemeal. They're doing them all the time. It all depends on how that is. And again, you identify service areas. It needs to tie closely with the comprehensive plan because you size your water lines, your sewer lines based upon projected future growth for those areas. Again, serving the future growth areas needs to be kind of realistic. You don't want to have these huge areas of service and you can't pay for it until you actually have that those customers aligned. So you have to have an incremental expansion of your water and sewer plant if you want it to be effective. APFOs are a common tool to control the rate of growth. They are not intended to be a moratorium on growth. If there is an over commitment in terms of facilities, in terms of schools or whatever, there are occasions when there may be a moratorium associated with an APFO, but it's intended to be short-term, and an APFO is not a long-term solution to your growth management. It is intended to regulate the pace of growth when there is a situation that gets out of control. I again, worked in the city of Frederick. Pace of growth in the the 20s was so rapid, we used up all our water, and we had not had a good enough handle on it, and so we had to have a moratorium for a while, and then afterwards we then put in place a regulatory system to control that. An APFO helps you regulate the predictability and the management of growth. It does not, and it should not be used as a solution to stop growth. 13 counties and 23 municipalities have APFOs. It's a tool to regulate, particularly in fast growth areas. Other areas don't adopt them because they don't have that problem. Anyone can adopt them. Again, development approvals can be conditioned. They usually get approvals depending upon at what phase. Sometimes it's done at the subdivision stage, preliminary subdivision. They go through testing and they get assurances and they got allocations and they are able to move forward with that. If you don't have standards, you're in trouble. So you always got to have good standards, or else your APFO again will fail in terms of it being a moratorium. Jurisdictions are supposed to report to the Department of Planning every 2 years on whether or not they actually have had some areas where they've shut down development associated with that. We submit our reports to the state, to the General Assembly. July of every 2 years, it's due. Any questions of that? I'm going to go quickly. I'm not done yet. I'm not done. There's no questions here, so I'm on to the next section. I got 30 seconds to do the rest of it. Ding. So, capital improvements program is another implementation of it. Again, one of the things you're supposed to do at the local level often is actually ask your capital budgeting process, are you consistent with your comprehensive plan? Planning commissions are often asked to make a ruling and advise on that, so just keep that in mind. Sources of funding for capital projects, the typical general fund, community development block grant, state aid projects, so these are whole different sources of funds. The process for capital improvement programming is exactly the same as it is for most comprehensive plans. You go through an inventory, identify what your priorities are, you compilate a series of projects, you weight those project prioritization, and then you monitor the implementation of that. Annexations, municipalities. One thing you need to be aware of, process of annexations, Adam talked about it, it's in the local government article. These are the obvious facts for municipal annexations. Has to be contiguous. Can't annex another area in another jurisdiction. Go figure. And you can't create an enclave. So, and then I've got to follow the statute. Yes? There are those things. And they should be avoided. And I think at one particular point, that provision probably wasn't in the law that says you can't create them, and so they are what they are. Hopefully, get the lawyer on it. Hopefully, you'll reduce those over time. Hopefully, they will be annexed, or you try to resolve those. I don't think that it invalidates the jurisdiction per se, but you just have these enclaves that the rules don't apply to them that they apply elsewhere. So it becomes an enforcement problem. It becomes, why are they doing it and I'm not? It's a challenge. So whenever there's an enclave, I would try to get rid of the enclave. Figure out how I can do that. Now, the problem about annexation or municipalities and counties, go figure, I work at the municipal level, it's double taxation. So there is no incentive for a property owner, if they're developed, to become a municipality unless you find something that makes it advantageous, whether that's water and sewer or something. Sometimes if they're developed, you're stuck with it. So you may never be able to get rid of that enclave. I don't know. One way, I did this down in Florida. We went and bought the property. The city bought the property, annexed it, and then sold it. Guess what? Got rid of the enclave. So if you own it, you control it. So just saying. Okay. Rules of development in newly annexed areas, prohibition of development, limiting this. So one of the things to be aware of is if I'm annexing an area or if I'm a municipality, I don't have to annex. Some property owner says to you, oh, I want to annex. And you could say no. Municipalities are one of the few times, if they're outside and they want to come in, it's the old adage is it's easier to stay out than to get out. And it's the same token the other ways. It's easier to say, no, we don't want you in here. But once they're in there, you got to treat them like everyone else. So you can limit certain developments. There are provisions on the law that allows for you, if you don't want certain uses in that negotiation with them, you can restrict certain activities or certain densities in the annexation process. So that's part of the negotiations on, again, letting them in because they want to develop. Okay. Responsible. This is an interesting thing. I didn't obviously want to get into the details. This is the one scenario where contract zoning can be applied. A little bit, right? So development rights and responsibility agreements is essentially an agreement between a developer and the local government for a certain period of time. If they do certain things, you'll do certain things. Actually, what the development rights and responsibility agreement really says is we're not going to change the rules for 5 years or whatever for the duration of this rights and responsibilities. You're going to do your investment. We realize there's a bigger project here and you're going to be able to move forward. And we promise you're not going to be impacted if we change the rules within that 5-year period. Now, there is a provision that says unless extended otherwise. And if you're in Frederick County, under previous administrations, they extended them 20 years. And they are regretting that. And once the new election came along, it was hell to change. So be wary of making any agreements, deals for 20 years when that changes, and it's a nightmare. So I did some research on this development rights and responsibility. It's a useful tool when it's a big project. There's a major investment by the developer that benefits the community, but it's a two-way street, and be mindful. It's not really contract zoning per se at all, but some people will perceive it as because there is a contract, there is an agreement in place with expectations on both sides. But the law, the land use article has provisions in place that allow for it. Again, valid for 5 years only unless extended.
Usually extension 1 is 5 years. Normal.
It's up to the legislative body. So the legislative body, whoever you elect, Bill, I think you get 10 years. There's nothing in law that says it just says 5 years unless. So I don't know. So again, it's loosey goosey, and so I've seen them 20 years at the front end already, and they could have done it another 20 years if their elected officials wanted to extend it. So it's a dicey tool. Again, we got a lot of great resources out there. MACO's got great resources. MML's got great resources. Question I'm going to have here real quick, and I'm going to go to see there. Zoning can change through a comprehensive process, a piecemeal process, a referendum, or a lottery. A. The only one that you didn't choose, A. Okay, subdivision should be shown, should show proposed locations of? All the above. Where's the 17-year-old? Yeah. According to what state law, counties, water and sewer plans should be current up every 3 years. Funding for capital improvements includes 17-year-old, all the above. Unless amended or extended, local approvals, how long the development rights and responsibility agreement will last? B, 5 years. Which of the following is true about newly annexed land? Must be contiguous to the county's the municipality, can't be within another, can't create an enclave. D, all the above, all the above. Okay. There's your certificates. And I'm going to see real quick, just a couple minutes over here. Okay. No questions from the virtual audience. Any questions here? We had fun. We enjoyed it. I hope you have fun for the rest of MML. And thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm waving goodbye to the people in the virtual audience, and I'm going to sign off here momentarily. So folks, please take care. You will receive as long as I have an email, you will get your certificate, a link to the PowerPoint presentation, so you have that information, and that's about all of it. So, no, we got your name in it. We'll get it to you. You'll be good on that. That I don't know. Take care now. Everyone, take care. Bye now. Okay.
Thank you. Service.